Dear Miguel, Han Cheng, host team Renan, Hans, and Deep Park. Welcome to get together to enjoy this wonderful brainstorm about carbon footprint of biofuels. Also, welcome all the
因为有一则这篇文章我仔细
please,
看过，就
please
是
kindly
他们
mute your
是把那
microphones
个山
while
头
others speaking.
放在
Thank
那个
you.
水里面，然后给它转成了现
Oh, sorry. This is Heidi from Carbon Footprints and hope all of you enjoy this moment. Next, our webinar chair, Miguel, will introduce our speakers and the whole program. Hope everyone keeps the microphone silent while others speaking. There will be a 5 minutes question and answer session after each speaker's presentation, and welcome you to write down your questions in the comments box. Next, let's welcome Miguel to chair the following part.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And thank you to the journal Carbon Footprints for hosting this webinar. I'm very happy to be chairing this very interesting panel of researchers who have worked extensively on the topic. So I'm sure we will have a very high quality webinar. We have 7 speakers, which I will introduce to you in a minute. But before, I would like to say a few words about this new journal that I think was it a year ago, Heidi, that the journal came to existence, or I think about a year ago. So the journal is called Carbon Footprints, and it aims to advance the understanding of the extent to which the carbon footprints of various human activities influence the global ecosystem, as well as the technologies and social processes governing it. So it's a journal that is exclusively dedicated to the carbon footprinting of products. So it's the perfect place for us to show you our work on the carbon footprint of biofuels. It is an open access journal, so with an article processing charge of $1,200 US, and of course a peer review of 3 people. It's a single blind peer review. Your paper, if it's targeting the carbon footprint of human activities, would be very welcomed to be considered in our journal. The journal is published quarterly, so every 3 months we have a new issue. And related to this particular webinar, on the carbon footprint of biofuels, we welcome people to submit their work on this topic to the journal, and the first 10 related manuscripts related to this webinar will be exempted from the article processing charge. So I would welcome you to submit your work here. So today we have 7 speakers, as I've mentioned, from all sorts of places, I mean geographically. And we particularly would like to thank those who had to get up very early from, for example, the Pacific part of the US to join us. So thank you very much for taking the time for being here today. So the first speaker today is Horst Fehrenbach. He is the scientific director of IFEO in Heidelberg, Germany. He will talk to us about the Renewable Energy Directive 1, 2, and 3, I believe, and how the default values for the carbon footprint of biofuels were calculated. We then have Han-Cheng Dai. He is from the Institute for Global Health and Development of Peking University in China. He will talk to us about how China will supply bioenergy while still remaining carbon neutral, and the trade-off with food security. So a very interesting talk as well from Han-Cheng. Then I will talk a little bit about the ins and outs of modeling biofuel systems in LCA and how some misconceptions have formed along the years. So the aim of this talk is to dispel those misconceptions and to talk about how results are dependent from the methodological choices that the practitioner does. So that's the third talk. Then we have Tim Searchinger. I'm sure you've heard of Tim Searchinger. He has coined the term indirect land use change, a very useful notion indeed. He will talk about the carbon opportunity costs of using land for biofuels or for other climate change mitigation strategies. Then from Brazil, we have Renan Novaes, who is from Embrapa, the Empresa Brasileira de Pesquisa Agropecuária. He will talk about land use change, the direct land use change impacts and their importance in the carbon footprint of sugarcane ethanol. After Renan, we have Deepak Rajagopal. He's from UCLA. He will summarize the pros and cons of biofuels. Again, this will be very relevant and very welcomed indeed. And then finally, we will have Hans Langeveld from IEA Bioenergy and also from Biomass Research, who will talk about different ways of perceiving indirect land use change. He will present about contrasting narratives on the issue, a very interesting piece of research as well. So each presentation will last 20 minutes. So we actually have 3 hours and a half in which to conduct the webinar. And every 20-minute presentation will be followed by 5 minutes for questions and answers. And then at the end of it all, we will have another half an hour or so for a general discussion. The webinar will finish at 6 or just before 6, so we have plenty of time to cover these issues. So let's see how we're doing in time. Actually, it's just perfect. So let's give the floor to our first speaker, Horst Fehrenbach. Horst, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for being invited, having me, and try to share my screen. So it's okay. I think it will work immediately. So this one. And finally with this, we get the presentation mode. Does it work? Oh yeah, fine. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, calculation of greenhouse gas emissions of biofuels following the rules of the RED 1, 2, 3. It was good to notice, and so we have several updates, recasts of that. Specifically, it's not only, let's say, it might be a little bit boring just to talk about what is the technique, what are the methodological aspects. It's just a little bit also more about the loopholes in this calculations towards practical applications, limitations, and what is really the reason to apply this methodology. And yes, so this is, let's say, again, the title. And I will, first of all, try to explain, maybe not everybody is really familiar what's about RED, the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe. It's about the promotion of the use of energy from renewable sources. And it's a common framework, specifically, as you might notice by the title, for the promotion of energy from renewable sources in the EU. And it's about that binding EU targets for the overall share of energy from renewable sources is ruled in there, and it's about how much shall be the union's gross final consumption of energy, of renewable energy in 2030. So the red one, the RED one, was for 2020, and now we got updates who refer to 2030. It has from the beginning established, tried to establish sustainability criteria and greenhouse gas emission saving quota factors for biofuels, bioliquid, and in the meantime, with the RED 2 and now 3 on biomass fuels, so the whole spectrum, also with gas and solid biofuel for electricity and heat. Before it was specifically strong focus on biofuel for transport. And meanwhile, as was said before, RED 1, 2, 3. So we started 2008 with the RED 1, and now we have since October, very short term. Now we have the second recast. It is the RED 3 under the number 2023 2413. And what are these binding targets by the RED? So first of all, we have contributing towards the union target set. This is in the very first, in the very starting article, like Article 3, where we got the objectives of the whole directive. It's about the energy from renewable sources in the union's gross final consumption shall be in 2030 at least to 42.5%. This is on the one hand an overall target for renewable sources, but specifically in, let's say, deeper diving into the directive towards Article 25, then we come to renewable the share for the renewable energy within the transport sector, which shall be, have to put a little bit away the bar with the pictures. Well, maybe I can. Oh yeah, so this is better now. I haven't seen the full picture of my slide so far. Yeah, it's about the final consumption of the energy in the transport sector, and that should be at least, that must be at least 29% by 2030. Or you can select also from this, let's say, we call it the energetic percentage based on the energy ratio. We can also refer to the greenhouse gas intensity reduction and saying, okay, this reduction should be compared to standard emission situation at least 14.5% by, again, 2030. And at the third point about these targets, we have also fall under this is about also the eligibility for financial support. So if you don't meet these targets, you cannot go for financial support for the consumption of biofuel, bioliquids, and biomass fuel. Question is now, what are these greenhouse gas reduction requirements by the RED? This can be found in Article 29 and so forth. And it's again about the use of, for the greenhouse gas savings, for the use of biofuels, biogas, if consumed as biomethane, of course, in the transport sector, and also other bio liquids. And it should be at least, so if we have already existing plants operating already before the year 2015, October there, so you have just to manage a 50% saving rate. It shall be 60% at least if it's, let's say, the installation wasn't operating before the year 2021. And after that, it has to be, when it comes into operation, the 65%. What does it mean? It's a comparison for the fuel, the fossil fuel comparator, which is determined by 94 grams CO2 equivalents per megajoule, which is somewhere in one annex, the Annex 5, part C.9, where they can find this figure there. And now, what about our RED calculation rules? Again, something you find in an annex in there. You find there this formula. The big E means total emission of the fossil, of the fuel, of the use of the fuel in total. So the overall sum of all these single terms, which small e also always means some emission. And so we talk about emissions from cultivation, from land use change, specifically direct land use change in this case, the emissions from processing, transport, distribution, fuel in use. And then we got a couple of terms that have a minus. So these others were all plus, and there are also some minus terms. I will turn to them later on once again, but just to note that it's about things where we got some benefits from from biofuel productions. Which is not included in the whole calculation is the manufacture of machinery and equipment. And so it's just about the process and let's say the life cycle of processing and operations emissions. And another point of interest is also how to deal with the co-products. So it's a rather famous case that the RED already in 2008 determined to refer to the allocation methodology. It's the allocation based on the lower heating value in this case, which has been, as many of you might know, has been debated very, very strongly. So again, further out the RED calculation rules. So we got a couple of these bonus options. I will explain it a little bit more. So we get, first of all, first bonus option in terms of degraded land. We call it the degraded land bonus. So if you produce your cropping, your biofuel feedstock on severely degraded land, it has to be, of course, certified that's correct, that is correctly determined as for severely degraded land, then you can account for a bonus of 29 grams, which is embedded then in the calculation for the land use term EL, so which is for land use change. So it means what was the background behind that? So we had this discussion in 28 and the years before very strongly on question how to integrate effects, indirect effects by, for instance, indirect land use change. We will talk later on more about that. In that case, it was determined to not to deal with negative indirect land use change effects or emissions, positive emissions, to turn it into a positive ILUC avoidance bonus. So if you work on, if you drop on severely degraded land, then you don't have no competition to other cropping because nobody would ever crop in there, and that's why you get that bonus. Then there's this other bonus, which is about improved agricultural management bonus, and the ESCAR, the ESCA bonus, which is about the carbon storage in agricultural soils. We'll see that's very hard to prove. You don't see really a guarantee for long-term storage. And so on the other hand, what we also see, there are only the positive effects accounted. So if you have a negative situation in there, so you have a degrading time kind of cropping, specifically on land for which can be also on organic soils, then it's not these emissions that are then triggered might not really be covered by that because you only get a bonus, you don't get a malus by that term. Then we have another bonus that's it's on, and this one is again also the manure, so called manure bonus or wet manure bonus, is embedded in included in this ESCA calculation, where when you have a production of biogas based on manure, animal manure as a substrate, then again you get a bonus on 45 grams CO2 per megajoule, and then subsumed under this bonus in here. And the last one to mention, again, the third one, we have four, of course. So we talk about the CCS, so the carbon capture and storage one, but we have also a CCR bonus, which is on carbon capture and recovery, which is, let's say, identical with carbon capture in use. And so this is the question, where might this come into play? So naturally, mostly not. So if it could be, if you have a BECCS operation, of course, then by a big plant, which you're capturing then the CO2 from the stack, then you might have this case. But if you go for a biofuel transport, it's hard to imagine how it could be captured by a car. And so this is mostly meant where CO2 could be captured as a byproduct from processing, and the example I will show later on is on ethanol, where we get CO2, for instance. And then the question is, yeah, it should be their substitution, validated substitution for production of fossil CO2 instead of the application of the CO2 from here. And this is again something which is very hard in question, how to prove that substitution in there. So first judgment here on the calculation rules as some intermediate conclusion here. Yeah, at first sight, first of all, we have a good coverage of, let's say, the wide scope of a product life cycle of biofuel. On the other side, we see that this calculation represents really somehow a wild mixture of attributional things like where we see the allocation by the heating value and so forth. On the other side, on consequential elements, which are mostly of these bonus effects in there. And so on the end, it's which also very, very important to see. So we talk only about direct land use change as when we talk about direct land use change in there. So these calculations are obviously very focused, and they are meant to be very focused on very concrete consignments. So it's describing really the chain of custody for, let's say, there's one consignment coming from some very specific plantation somewhere around the world, transported and ending up in somewhere for, let's say, an economic operator who is obligated to report and to be in line with the RED criteria in there. So this is for the very first step. And so, of course, on the other side, another point, these calculation rules are obviously also designed specifically to give incentives, to incentivize improvements concerning the greenhouse gas avoidance, which might be in many cases really in detail very hard to verify, because it's not a generic calculation. It's not about what is in general better or worse. So it's very concrete on this tracking down this chain of custody. And on the other side, we got also the possibility to take up default values, which are meant to be somewhere, if you don't want to make your calculation, you can use default values, which are also listed in the Annex 5 in there. And these default values are in many cases not very conservative. They are, let's say, some typical negative practices are ignored in this default values, and that's why many applicants here have the opportunity to get really good results without really having real good results. So again, as a first judgment, it looks like that they don't appear to be suitable to give the entire greenhouse gas performance, and therefore not to judge on biofuel options for general policy decisions. So this is, let's say, a very first impression on this stage, and I want to try whether it is, let's say, validated also by going a little bit deeper into some of these loopholes. So why is there a problem in there? So first of all, looking on that carbon capturing and replacement, this ECCR bonus value in there. So just to give you a couple of numbers, we looked up in Germany, in the reported greenhouse gas intensities for bioethanol, average calculations, overall, everything that was reported according to the RED exactly with that rules. And we found out in Germany, let's say there are thousands of tons really accounted for and reported, and we are around 7.4 to 11 gram CO2 for the whole life cycle of this per megajoule of the whole life cycle of the ethanol from let's say mostly corn and other cereals. When we look on, let's say, the partial default or typical value in the ROD, so we found values that are already around, just for the calculation, we found values that are already 20 grams. So the question is how I can get from 20 grams in one term down to 11 or even lower. And again, also looking on the typical overall life cycle values that are at least 30 grams. And that should be somewhere a realistic term. So we see what happens to the calculation. And we learned that capturing the CO2 from ethanol fermentations and sold to greenhouse farmers in order to boost the growth of tomatoes, for instance, is the practice behind that. And that's really the mainstream practice in there, specifically in Germany, accounted ethanol. The question is, does this captured CO2 really avoid global warming? Would this CO2 deliberately be produced if the bioethanol wouldn't be available? That is a very good question. It could be specifically in winter time where there's heating and the off gases from the heaters from that farmers went automatically into the greenhouses. That might be then a good point, but in summertime, and nobody would ever just fire natural gas in order to produce CO2 that the tomatoes would grow better. It's really a very open question in there. Another loophole is about the improved agricultural management, and in there the ESCA factor. What we realize also in the reported data in Germany, now specifically looking on biodiesel, and we find a case on biodiesel from Brassica carinata. And this Brassica carinata case, maybe it might be also familiar to others. In the German balance, we find it with reported, calculated minus 105 up to minus 122 grams CO2 equivalents per megajoule. So this is really, you remember, 94 is the comparator for fossil diesel, and this is minus 100 and something. Looks like that this is really, yeah, and also when you look on the very familiar rapeseed biodiesel, we have values on around 20 plus 22 grams CO2 per megajoule. What is the reason about that? So first of all, the calculations and input data are not publicly available, so they are not transparent. We don't know it exactly. We just have some information on informal communication. And what we know is that Brassica carinata is cropped as an intercrop, and it might lead then, of course, to an increase of organic carbon in the soil. And you remember the ESCA, improved agricultural management, can go accounting for that. But on the other side, the question is really whether this might really happen on long term. So this carbon is really safely prevented from emissions, or we have really an increase of carbon storage there. So this might be really also partly in question. So might be really only a carbon saving on paper and not in reality. So that is open for discussion. And so now
2 minutes, Horst.
Yeah, sorry. And maybe very, very briefly also about the biomethane question in there. So it might be fair enough to bring in also that bonus for wet manure with a minus 103. And but if you combine it again then with a calculation for maize, and it is allowed to get to calculate a mixture, then you can improve the performance, of course, of maize, of growing maize, a whole plant for biomethane, by mixing it up with wet manure. And it is the question whether this, if it makes sense to attribute the positive effects, in this case, produced by biomethane from manure, to let's say, co-feedstocks such as maize take that strong advantage. And I jump now, let's say, also to the last point about the counterfactual picture. So what we see here now it's always around comparing to saving to fossil fuel in this case, which is the counterfactual system. And from our point of view, the counterfactual system is not complete, because the question is, if I don't grow the biomass, it's not only then I need fossil fuel. Then also I have land available for other applications. So I could use this for positive options in climate activities, foregone storage, and so forth. So we talk about carbon opportunity costs. We made a calculation in that case, just to show the dimension of these carbon opportunity costs. What you see in the middle bar is going to the right-hand side. This is the emission from biofuel production. Let's say a bandwidth range from 10 to 18 million tons for the EU, the whole EU. We made the calculation for the EU 27 plus UK. This would be then the saving from substituted biofuels, and for substituting the fossil fuels by biofuel, which is then around 42 in this case, million tons. But if you would then in that case use, instead of cropping, you would use the agricultural area for accumulating CO2 and carbon, and do it all in these areas where we get in Europe our biofuels, then there would be an annual increase of the storage of about 66 million tons, which is, if you take the overall net balance of that, then shows that with this foregone opportunity costs of crop-based biofuels, we would profit much more for climate activities than with just only substituting fossil fuels. So my last slide, and it's somehow we somehow get an confirmation of our first thinking. So in general, the scope of the RED greenhouse gas calculation is adequate with regard on its focus on very concrete assignments described along the control chain of custody, and its intention to support improved practices. But the RED greenhouse gas calculation applied by stakeholders and just controlled by the certification system obviously leaves room for dressing up the results, just partly speaking. Yeah. And finally, the scope of the RED greenhouse gas calculation is not adequate to give the entire performance of biofuel. So furthermore, the reported numbers, from my point of view, are not adequate to judge on biofuel options for general policy decisions. So sorry for being a little bit beyond my time. Thanks a lot for listening.
That's fine, Horst. Thank you very much for your very great presentation. I would like to ask the audience to keep their questions until the end of the seminar, because it's already time for the second presenter. Could I then have Han-Cheng Dai uploading his presentation, please? Just to remind you, Han-Cheng is from Peking University, and he will talk about supplying biomass energy for China's 2060 carbon neutrality without threatening food security. Han-Cheng, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for organizing this wonderful webinar. And I'm Han-Cheng Dai from Peking University. And today, my topic, as shown here, is about the bioenergy supply for in China to provide enough negative emissions on the one hand, but without threatening the food security and global sustainability on the other hand. So this is a integrated assessment. So this is my structure, and as you all know that there's the very complex interactions between human system and natural system. So any solution to address, for example, the climate crisis may need the support or resources from other systems like land or water, other energy. So our team actually is trying to, in order to address this planetary crisis, and our team does research, basically use macroscopic models to study the system transformation that help us to hit the target of sustainable development, and in some maybe cost-effective or low-risk pathways. So to find a good pathway to achieve those great goals. So this study is one of the trial in our recent years. And yeah, the broader background is that in order to achieve carbon neutrality, so on the one hand, we can reduce or increase the renewable energy, which is zero carbon and can substitute fossil fuels. But we should know that maybe that need a lot of investment, and the recent progress may be not in line as expected or rapid as expected. So in order to, the side of the story would be increase the negative emissions that can neutralize the residue emissions in the long term. And yeah, in some global assessment like this IPCC 1.5 special report, we can see here that in one of those 4 representative pathways, so the scientist has anticipated that maybe biomass in the yellow color may play a very big role in the near to longer term to provide the negative emissions that is needed to neutralize the lazy effort in the near term that may leave a lot of emissions in the near term. But yeah, so this is one of the possibilities. So anyway, bioenergy may play a very important role from the global assessment, and also from many studies. And as you can see that broadly, we should look at the negative emissions technologies. And we have a lot of options here as shown here. And here in this study, I just want to emphasize the bioenergy equipped with carbon capture. And if you look at the other, the numbers, the cost and the potential. So here, as highlighted here, the bioenergy plus CCS, sorry, maybe this is US dollar per ton of CO2. Their cost is perhaps acceptable compared with other alternatives, and also low cost potential that is lower than 100 US dollar per ton CO2. Okay, would be globally, and in US would be a huge amount of the potential. So this is why bioenergy CCS is greatly looked at. And but on the other hand, we also see that we also have some other negative emissions alternatives like direct air capture. And so some studies has also compared the relative advantage of bioenergy, BECCS and the DAC. So the conclusion is that BECCS has a positive and negative output as shown here, but a lower deployment cost as shown here. So the cost is lower, and we also have energy output because it is energy itself. But it needs a lot of land and water, which may compete for other resources with agriculture, and also any expansion in one country may transfer the embedded environmental burdens through the global food supply import and import. So the question here is that how can we provide such a very large-scale biomass energy supply without jeopardizing the national food security, and also without threatening the global environmental burden on the food supply or food trade partners countries, like especially when China joins the food trade market. This was a big global impact. And we studied, did some literature review and looked at the existing studies, what they think China's future energy structure and how much bioenergy would be there. So we find a very big range, some lower part by 2060 would be 6 exajoule, but higher end would be over 50 exajoule. So accounting for 5% to over 60% of the total primary energy share. So that is a big range. So anyway, in our study, we take a medium to lower end as indicated in the red line. So that is about 16 exajoule. And also accounting for 17% of the total primary energy supply in China by 2060. But the big thing for this number is that it can provide 1.3 billion tons of negative emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent at that time, in that year. So that is approximately equivalent to the land-based terrestrial carbon sinks. I mean the natural-based solutions. But we also know that this is a big benefit if we can really use this much bioenergy. But on the other hand, we also know that it will have many multiple side effects on the food system, on the cross-border transfer of the environmental burden to the other countries, like land competition, and also increase the bilateral import of food, and also rising food prices. So even though we try to assess, is there any optimal pathway for us to achieve the triple goal, carbon neutrality, as shown here, and also food security in the middle, and global sustainability. I mean, without threatening the global trading partners, their environmental burden of providing the food that may be need to export to China. So we did a integrated assessment model with the big models, Global China model, in cooperation with EASA in Austria. So this paper was published recently on Nature Food. So so I mean, maybe my background is a little bit far from many of you. So we are the integrated assessment models. So perhaps many of you may know that there are some big teams all over the world, and also we are developing the IMAD model in our team. And but in this time, so we are using or collaborating with EASA using their Global model, which is a partial equilibrium agriculture economic model. And also, of course, in our just one word about our model system. So it is incorporated into our IMAD model system at our university. So it's a part of the very important part of the Global model. Is it's a very important part of the module in our whole system. But in our community, we normally try to consider so many aspects, as I showed in the first slide, natural and human system, and to find by compare the cost effectiveness and also compare the potential trade-offs, and also try to maximize the synergy while minimize the potential trade-offs in order to find we call it the pathway or policy, great policy mixture, and also a optimized pathway to help us achieve the great goals on the left-hand side. So anyway, here, by using the global model, so we set up 7 scenarios, so step by step, as you know. So reference is SSP2, and without big expansion of the bioenergy. But the second scenario is we expand bioenergy supply in China. So all the 16 exajoule is planted in China domestically. So you can imagine that it will occupy additional land to produce those huge amount of bioenergy. And then the food price of other crops and livestock may increase in China. So leading us to, we have to import additional amount of food from other provinces or other countries. And so the other 5 scenarios to examine if in the second scenario we may face a lot of conflicts. Maybe this will threaten our food security, because we will face increased food prices and decreased food availability and calorie intake. So we try to solve those food security step by step. One is to free the trade. So that means we still allow China to import the main staple food, because we also have some red lines for import self-sufficiency for the 3 main staple crops like rice, corn, and wheat. So in the third scenario, we try to relax it. So in order to lower the domestic price, and then we will also see maybe some negative impact will be happening in the trading partners. So the next 4 scenarios is to enhance the domestic food system efficiency, which is defined as we increase the yield of the 3 main crops, and also we reduce the food loss and food waste in the distribution and consumption phase. And then we also try to adjust the diet to reduce the consumption of the meat and substitute by the plant-based food. But also we also refer to some guidelines in China, so it's not just to reduce it drastically, but also in line with the China's own healthy diet guidelines. And then final one is to mix the following the above 4 scenarios, so make a optimized policy mix. So I try to be a little bit fast in the following slides. So if you have interest, you can read our paper on Nature Food. So because of time limitation. So the first slides, we look at if we only expand the bioenergy, what will happen? So we do see some disastrous impact, like we need a lot of 51 million hectares of land to produce bioenergy in China. This is approximately equal to the whole land area of Thailand. And then this 50 million hectares is in the expense of the other land use, like cropland, grassland, and other natural vegetation land. So you can imagine that we have a reduced cropland, grassland, other natural land vegetation. So the food price will increase, and also maybe for the natural vegetation, maybe the biodiversity will also even deteriorate. So in order to provide the bioenergy energy plant. And also we can see that the agriculture prices, aggregated price increased by 23%, and per capita daily calorie decreased by 8%. Another, of course, but good news is that the irrigation water, nitrogen use, and the AFLU greenhouse gas emissions could reduce because we produce less food, but more maybe natural irrigated bioenergy. So we see some negative impact. So we, as I introduced, we find some measures step by step to reduce it, like free the trade limitation, and then we can see that our the self-sufficiency rate of the the rice and the maize will reduce to less than 95%, especially wheat and rice. But okay, maize is still okay. But then on the other hand, so other countries like Australia and Thailand may need to increase a lot of export to China of the wheat or other rice and so on. So which also creating a lot of environmental burden like irrigation water or fertilizer use and increased greenhouse gas emissions. So we accounted those embedded environmental burden on the other countries. So then we also try to add the other measures like in addition to free trade, but we increase the yield in China and reduce the food loss in China and switch to healthy diet in China, and also combine all the other 3-4 measures. And then we do see some positive signals that the environmental burden like nitrogen use, water use, and other agricultural land use, I mean the virtual land in other countries, rest of the world will reduce gradually. So that is good news. So I don't want to go into each number because of time limitation. So if we combine all these optimized measures, so in the food system scenario, that is the enhanced food efficiency scenario. So every indicator as shown in this radar chart would be much better than the dashed area, which is even the baseline. So without bioenergy expansion scenario. So the area, green area here is inside the area of the dashed line. That means, every indicator improves So we can produce, yes, we can produce so much bioenergy. And also we don't need to mean that calorie intake will reduce, but even it increases. And also the other prices is also lower, and also irrigation water lower, and also other imported or virtual fertilizer use is also lower. So that is a great way of solving it. And also the virtual use of nitrogen, irrigation water, and agricultural land in the rest of the world also performs better than before. So that is overall image. So for specific numbers, you can read our paper again. So we also tested the robustness of this study. So in addition to the 7 scenarios, we added nearly 100 other scenarios to test the sensitivity and to the assumptions and the parameters. So overall, it is robust, and also our previous findings are we have a relatively high confidence on our previous main findings. And also, so this leads to a take-home message is that China can achieve carbon neutrality via large-scale bioenergy production, domestic production, with huge negative emission potential. This is 1.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, without endangering China's domestic food security or increasing the environmental burden of its food trade partners. So these are some graphic abstract of the previous findings. And also we did some very brief interpretation of our findings. For example, one thing is that we can doubling the emission space of China by 2060 because this 1.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent negative emissions is comparable to the terrestrial and marine organic carbon sink, which is concluded or calculated by the some other expert in China. So then the emission space in 2060 would be nearly 3 billion tons of CO2 under the carbon neutrality target. So this can reduce the cost of the reduction in other sectors. And also we looked at the yield up scenario. So this is the ideal of theoretical productivity based on the agriculture expert on crop, corn, rice, and wheat yield. So our assumption in the blue line is, just maybe closed the gap by 75% of the gap in the base year. So this is not achieve the ceiling or the theoretical productivity, but just 75%. That means to ensure the feasibility of our assumption. And also we compared the dietary change as I introduced in the beginning. So we referred to the Chinese dietary guidelines released by China's own government in 2022 and find that our assumptions is more or less fall in the range of the recommended intake of different animal-based food. So we should say that this assumption in the healthy diet scenario is still also not that unrealistic. And also for the future, I think we should, almost finished. Maybe we need to seriously think of some roadmap to realize this large number of CO2 emission, biomass energy production in the longer term. And also, finally, as I said, we are a integrated assessment model team. So in our team also provides some training workshop in China. So maybe if you in the future any of you have interest, you are welcome to join us or contact us or collaborate with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Han Cheng. Such an interesting study you've conducted. We have a couple of questions from the audience written in the box. One is by Jikai Zhao from UTRGV saying, I am curious about which bioenergy, biogas, liquid fuels, etc., produced in this study. If we use biomass, corn stover with straw or cotton stalk to produce such bioenergy, we don't have to occupy new croplands to do so.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Did I stop sharing?
Yes.
Anyway, here we are mainly use the short rotation plantations, and we didn't study, investigate how this much bioenergy will be used in the end use sectors or in the energy transformation sectors. We are doing that research, but we imagine that most of it may be used for power generation, and either mixed with coal, equipped with CCS and others, or used for heating. So one of another of my PhD student is now studying how we can digest this bioenergy, yes, by 2060 in different sectors. So yeah, but rough image, it would be most of them will be used for power generation and heating generation, because biogas, bio liquid, because China's current strategy and also past experience, for example, the transportation sector, we are maybe we will be more reliant on the electric vehicle rather than the biodiesel or biofuel powered vehicle. And in the household residential sector, we did have some pilot project in the past to expand the biogas project in the villages, but that is not very much successful. And so in the current expert or consensus, it seems that we will not use too much biogas in the future. So that is so maybe the anyway, the short rotation plantations and the energy crops is the main form of the bioenergy as assumed here. Okay, so I don't know if I
you did. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Also, another question: how much agricultural land will we need to meet the 2060s goal? Question by Wang Lu.
Yeah, you mean the land for for producing or providing bioenergy?
I guess so. Yes.
Yeah. One of the slides I mentioned the number is 51 million hectare.
Million hectares. Yes.
Yeah, that is as I said, is almost the same as the whole land area of Thailand. So it's a huge amount of land. So
that is impressive. Yeah,
impressive. It's impressive. Yeah,
the sheer amount of land is impressive. I also have a question of my own. How realistic or likely do you think it is that all those parallel measures would be implemented to mitigate the impacts of the bioenergy demand? The increase in yield, the decrease in food waste, the change in diets, etc.
Yes. So that's why in the last slides we theoretically we checked partly how realistic or how feasible it is. So just want to show that our assumption on the how much the yield gap can be closed, and what is a healthy diet look like, especially the animal-based food. So by compare with the guideline, and also I forgot to mention that on the food loss, currently China wasted about 27% of the food. So maybe comparable to the global level, global maybe around 30%. And in our assumption here, you just want to halve the food loss from 27% to around 13% food loss. So I hesitate to comment that so the ideal assumed measures here in our study is great, is doable. So just to want to emphasize that if we do this to this extent, then this will have huge benefit on the other invisible aspect for the bioenergy, for carbon neutrality. So this is maybe our scientific value of our intention of doing this research. But really, we are not the policymakers, so we cannot say too much about, okay, we should do this. We can do this. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now I have my own turn. Hello? Yeah, okay. So I would like to talk about life cycle assessment or carbon footprinting, a subset of LCA, and the uncertainty that is incurred by certain methodological choices that the practitioner does. So I have I have here an overview of why we are interested in biofuels in the first place. So they came as a strategy. It was deemed that the use of biofuels as a replacement for fossil fuels were deemed as a proper strategy for climate change mitigation. So that was the starting point for all the attention that biofuels have received over the last 20 years or so in Europe and also in the US and in other parts of the world. At the same time, the need for assessing the climate impacts of bioenergy systems became obvious. It was not just about the carbon or the CO2 that was emitted at tailpipe, but also all the emissions that took place in order to have that biofuel produced. So life cycle assessment was elected as the appropriate tool with which we could measure these life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. But the application of this tool incurs in a big level of uncertainty, which means that individual estimates tend to be very variable depending on who conducts the study or who does the methodological choices that you need to do whenever you do an LCA. So I want to talk about these issues that are still unresolved in the carbon footprinting of biofuel systems, but in LCA in general, because they really are the reasons why results vary this much. So let's dig into that. And then finally, I will conclude with some insights and prospects in terms of the uncertainty and relevance of LCA for decision support for biofuels or renewable energy in general, or just the transition towards more sustainable production and consumption systems. One might be led to believe, especially 20 years ago when this whole debate initiated, that bioenergy is carbon neutral. This is because the carbon emitted or the CO2 emitted upon combustion is the same as the carbon that was sequestered via photosynthesis as the biofuel feedstock grew. So far, so good. However, this simplistic notion of the system excludes a bunch of things that we now know that we have to take into account in order to make an appropriate assessment of bioenergy and really have a scientific basis to decide whether we should be promoting biofuels or not. So if biofuels do incur in fewer greenhouse gas emissions than their fossil fuel counterparts, then sure, let's promote them. But do they really? So the question is how we actually know whether biofuels ought to be promoted or not. But we at least do know that bioenergy is not carbon neutral, even though the biogenic parts of the bioenergy may balance out if it's at least not released as methane and as CO2. But then in order to get the biofuel in the market, you need to grow it, you need to cultivate land, you need to apply agrochemicals, you have land use change that needs to take place in order to make way for the energy crop. You have albedo effects, you have non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So no, bioenergy really is not carbon neutral. It may be carbon positive, it may be carbon negative, but it's certainly not neutral. This is already known for many years. There's nothing new here. What was interesting to see almost 15 years ago, I think, was that LCA as a tool with which you can add the emissions that occur at the different life cycle stages of any product, of a biofuel product, is really what you need to estimate in order to say something useful about the biofuel's ability to mitigate climate change. And this was already known in 1997. This was a long time ago. It wasn't actually called life cycle assessment. This was work produced by Bernard Schlammadinger at IEA Bioenergy, where the emissions of the bioenergy systems were the emissions that accumulated over the course of its life cycle. And if you wanted to have a useful comparison, you would have to do the same on a fossil fuel comparator across the same functionality. And then, yes, then you could say something useful about whether biofuels saved on greenhouse gas emissions or not. And here on the right-hand side, you can see what Horst has already shown in his presentation, which is that the total emissions of a biofuel should be estimated as the addition of the emissions occurring at the different life cycle stages. This is in Annex 5 of the Renewable Energy Directive, which was indeed a very big encouragement to the LCA community that what we were doing was relevant also for policymaking. So with this application, the application of this approach allowed the European Commission to know and distinguish the feedstocks that met certain criteria from the feedstocks that did not. And in the original Renewable Energy Directive of 2009, the aim was to save 35% greenhouse gas emissions relative to fossil fuels. And with the application of LCA, we were able to determine the amount of emissions saved and whether they abided by the targets or whether they were under the threshold of GHG savings. And you could see here that for three very popular biofuel feedstocks, so wheat, soybean, and palm oil, the first for ethanol and the second two for biodiesel, the emission savings did exist, but it was not enough to meet the 35% threshold. So then the European Commission knew that these three feedstocks should not be supported because they didn't meet their preconceived targets, while others did in this case. This is data from the JRC, just to show you the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of different biodiesel feedstocks for HVO and FAME. And you can see how this compares with the fossil fuel comparator, which has ranged between 85 and 95 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. So that line you see there represents the emissions from whatever the biofuel is displacing. So 1 megajoule of, oh, something is happening in my slides. Anyway, that's the level of fossil fuel emissions. This is the original level in the directive, so 35% savings. And you can already see that some biofuel feedstocks do not meet this criterion. But with time, with RED 2 and 3, this target became increasingly ambitious. So if in 2010 we had 35% savings as a minimum requirement, in 2017 you had 50, and then 60, and then 65% savings in 2021, like Horst mentioned. But then from 2023 onwards, the minimum level of greenhouse gas savings is actually 70%. So it's extremely ambitious, meaning that fewer and fewer feedstocks will be eligible for European Commission support. And the same for bioethanol. In fact, from 2023 with a 70% savings requirement, there's only 1 or 2 that actually meet this criterion. So with this, I point out that life cycle assessment and the life cycle assessment approach, which is what you adopt when you do a carbon footprint, is needed in order to tell us where to go, which bioenergy feedstocks we should be promoting and which ones we should not, because they don't meet what we want them to meet. And this is a piece of work I've published last year, where I also try to estimate the carbon footprint of different biofuels with European Commission's data, with the same data as in the Renewable Energy Directive, but doing it in slightly different ways. So you have the default values where I added direct land use change, but also indirect land use change, which in some versions is mutually exclusive, and according to some interpretations, it is not. And also with an attributional and a consequential approach. And you can see here that the range of estimates is actually quite large, at least for some of the feedstocks. So the question really is, why do values vary all that much? And here you can see a chart published by the IPCC, the Renewable Energy and Climate Change Mitigation Special Report. And you can see that results are very variable for fossil fuel feedstocks, not so much for nuclear energy, even less for renewable energy. But then for biopower, or what they call biopower, which is liquid biofuels and bioenergy, the results are not only extremely variable, but they vary from positive values to negative values. So clearly something needs to be addressed in the way in which we calculate these carbon footprints. So I've done some work on this, and what I think what it boils down to is that people who conduct these carbon footprints have different goals and scopes. They do things different. So there's two issues within the goal and scope definition from which results may vary. And then there's one related to life cycle impact assessment. So these are the characterization models that are used to characterize and find a common denominator between different greenhouse gas emissions, and also the timing of the different fluxes. Within the first set of issues, I think the use of attributional modeling or consequential modeling, which in turn determines how the system boundary is delimited, very much affects the results generated, particularly because it determines how you deal with co-production. So in attributional LCA, you usually refer to allocation. You create somewhat arbitrarily an allocation key for dividing or partitioning the burdens between two product systems. And in consequential LCA, you use substitution, which, in my view, is far more relevant for supporting decision-making, particularly at the policy level. And then the second issue within the goal and scope definition is what you decide to adopt as a reference system for land use. Most LCA studies don't adopt any reference, but if you don't use land for something, you might use land for something else, or it might be allowed to regenerate or relax, as we call it in life cycle assessment, and therefore that is the appropriate measure against which you should assess your biofuel production system. And on the second level of concerns or uncertainty, you have different characterization models like global warming potentials that give you different answers. And this is indeed another source of uncertainty that I will also talk about. On the modeling side of the equation, you have two large approaches which are competing. Just as a warning, I belong to the consequential approach, but there are several definitions for each of these competing modeling approaches. I chose this definition because I find them more complete and more mutually exclusive. So an attributional approach is a system modeling approach in which inputs and outputs are attributed to the functional unit of a product system by linking and or partitioning the unit processes of the system according to a normative rule. I've highlighted the bits I find relevant here. And this normative rule would be, for example, to base your allocation key on the relative attributes of the co-products. For example, the energy content or the mass content or the economic value. Alternatively, you have the consequential approach, which is a system modeling approach in which activities in a product system are linked so that activities are included in the product system to the extent that they are expected to change as a consequence of a change in the demand for the functional unit. I've got to apologize. I know this is a mouthful, but these really are the most elegant definitions I've come across. And if you want to see this in an illustrative manner, you can see that while consequential approaches, they model additionality. So whatever happens as a result of your decision at the margin, in addition, as well as whatever may be displaced as a consequence of your product system. And in attributional LCA, you partition emissions between different economic activities. And like our colleague Wich Plevin pointed out, using attributional LCA to estimate climate change mitigation misleads policymakers. And I wholeheartedly agree with the title of his paper. So if you apply the different approaches, so you have 4 approaches being applied to every feedstock. The first 2 are the ones of the Renewable Energy Directive with direct land use change and with indirect land use change. And then you have the attributional approach and finally the consequential approach. And in this slide, you can really see how results vary depending on the modeling approach applied. And one of these issues is related to how you model indirect land use change, which many of our colleagues still think does not happen. It's not real. So I have here an example that shows you, for example, when you convert grasslands to annual cropland in order to, for example, grow feedstock for ethanol, you incur direct land use changes because grassland would have a higher carbon stock on lands than wheat. So that's the direct land use change part. It's easy to measure. It's verifiable. And usually you divide the total emissions of the subsequent 20 years of cropping in order to attribute a particular value to 1 year's worth of cropping. But in addition to these impacts, you have indirect land use change impacts, which is where the grassland, which used to be fed to livestock and is no longer, does not mean that the livestock will no longer be fed. So that livestock will have to be fed in some other way. And the most likely way, the marginal way, is that soybean meal or soybeans would have to be produced, probably in South America, and likely at the expense of rainforest conversion with high carbon stocks associated to that. So these are the elements of the reference system that needs to be taken into account if you really want to do a complete life cycle assessment. And fortunately, the EU commissioner did understand this, and she actually said when the ILUC directive was published that some biofuels receiving EU subsidies are as bad as, or even worse, than the fossil fuels they replace. So how do we actually estimate indirect land use change emissions? It's notoriously difficult. This shows you just the range of values from -200 to +600 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. So you can see that the range is extremely large. And it doesn't really help decision makers adopting a specific value that they feel confident with. So what the European Commission did was to go with the IFPRI model, and these are the factors they have adopted. Well, they didn't adopt in policy, but these were the ones that were more recommended above others, let's say it this way. Here I want to show you a study where I try to model the climate change impacts of producing ethanol from corn in the US. So the US government has this target of 15 billion gallons of ethanol every year, which translates into 45 million tons of bioethanol, which displaces gasoline. So far, so good. But then what does it take in order for these 45 million tons of bioethanol being produced? So I tried to estimate this consequentially, where this corn would come from. Some would come from existing land, some would come from expanded land, some would be diverted from other markets, for example, the animal feed market or the vegetable oil market, and others even from food. And also you have to include that when you produce bioethanol, you produce dry distillers grains with solubles, which is also used as an animal feed. So we had to balance different markets to make it right. And the results are here. So you can see that large emissions are avoided from the avoided use of gasoline and also from the avoided soybean cultivation, because when you grow when you shock the feed market with DDGS, you also avoid alternative feed production. So those are the benefits of the policy, which are not insignificant. But then if you take into account the additional emissions that take place, also because of the balancing of those markets, then you realize that for climate change mitigation, using bioenergy, using ethanol from corn in the US is actually not a very effective policy. And this is related to the third factor upon which uncertainty lies, which is the impact assessment models, and depending on which one you use, some of these I created myself, some of these models, bioenergy may either be better or worse than the fossil fuel it replaces, depending on how you assess the timing of emissions and the asymmetry with which carbon is either sequestered or released. And this basically summarizes the different sources of uncertainty. It was also published last year. So I know I'm running a bit over my time. I would just like to conclude with this slide and perhaps the next one, which is to say that uncertainty and precision are two different things. You have here a situation where the precision is very large, so the values are not variable. They're very close to one another, but very far from the bullseye. So the results here are biased, while here you have a high accuracy of estimates, but the precision is very low because all these estimates are very far apart from one another, but you could be said to be having representative results. And like I tell my students, it is much more important to be able to survey the set of possible systems approximately than to examine the wrong system exactly. It is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. I really think we need to have this in mind whenever we do our models. So my final slide is this, the carbon footprinting of biofuel systems. Carbon footprinting is very relevant and its relevance is growing. There are ISO standards, there are several guidelines. Perhaps this proliferation of guidelines is actually not that useful, which represents a lack of consensus in the scientific community about how to actually carry out a carbon footprint. So in my mind, we need increasing harmonization in LCA practice. But we have derived some insights when applying the carbon footprint to biofuel systems. And the first one is that they're not necessarily better than the fossil fuels they replace, but doing a proper carbon footprint allows us to identify the worst from the best. And that's why biofuels may still play a role in climate change mitigation, and so does the tool itself, carbon footprinting. I would also like to say that methodological choices do determine the results, particularly because they define how the system boundary is set and whether indirect effects are included or excluded. And finally, I'd just like to say that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we need to do all these complex decisions, and LCA and carbon footprinting can help us making the right decision, but we need to do it in a way that we do not shift burdens where we cannot see them. So thank you very much for your attention, and apologies for running over time. I think we have 1 minute left for questions. I'm going through the box. Okay, regarding the slide with the variations in carbon footprint, were these values for the same biofuel, raw material, process, and location? No, they were not. Location, yes, it refers to Europe, unless we're talking about palm oil, which refers to Southeast Asia, mainly Malaysia and Indonesia. Because if it wasn't, I'd really expect a big variation, since it depends on biomass and varies a lot depending on the parameters mentioned above. You are correct, but these variations that I've been showing relate to the choices that the practitioner of carbon footprinting makes. So how to deal with co-production, how to deal with land use change, how to deal with indirect land use change, and not necessarily with the of agricultural systems. Okay, great. So just for the sake of keeping time, let's move on to the next presenter. Let's see, just a sec. So now we have Tim Searchinger, and Tim will talk to us about the carbon opportunity costs of different land uses. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. Tim, we are looking at the presenter's mode. I'm not sure if you can switch screens in order to, if
Okay.
you,
Oh, sorry, that was also muted. Let me see. Where do I push to switch? Sheesh.
on the top of your screen, you have
Oh,
use.
yeah, swap displays. There we are. Okay, let me get rid of this. Okay, very good. Well, thanks for having me. I'm going to build on some of the discussions that we've had today, but because of time, I'll just launch right in. And let me use a pen. So let me start with the fact that in the real world today, we are having massive agricultural expansion. So we finally had a good satellite study a couple of years ago, and it found that we were expanding annual cropland, not agricultural land, by 10 million hectares a year. There's evidence that permanent crops like oil palm, rubber are adding another 1 million hectares. So we're essentially clearing an area almost the size of England per year just to produce increased food. Some of this is due to biofuels too. A lot of it is due to biofuels too. And this basically, all the areas in red are the cropland expansion. Now, this number, by the way, is a net number. So there's also about 10 million hectares of land. So we're really clearing about 20 million hectares of land, and almost 10 are actually leaving cropland use, and many are reforesting. And I'll come back to that because that's important. So we have even more damage being done because the gross changing is more like 20 million hectares. So basically, we're on a pace where just for cropland alone, we're going to clear an area the size of Chile in the next, I'm sorry, India in the next 30 years. And that's not even counting pasture, which is the primary driver of deforestation, for example, in Latin America. And when you really talk to people, how do we actually feed the world without destroying the world? It's enormously challenging, even if we don't add biofuels. So that's the real world that we're in. And biofuels are an almost staggeringly inefficient use of land. Let me see if can I move that? So basically, if you have 1,000 joules of solar energy and you turn them into corn ethanol, maize ethanol, you get only about 1 joule net energy in the ethanol. Sugarcane ethanol 2, this is 3.5, not 35 for switchgrass in the most optimistic location estimated by DOE. So this is 3.5. And if you use PV on a net basis, this is even in the past, you're getting about 150 joules. So what this means is that, and we did an estimate, even viewed optimistically for future cellulosic ethanol, and all these areas in yellow or orange, you'll get a minimum of 100 times more usable energy using PV than using biofuels. And then on top of that, electricity has about a 3-to-1 benefit when you're using it in a car or even for a heat pump. And so you're really getting about 300 times more usable energy. And what this means is that even if we had, for other reasons, even if we had spare agricultural land, if you had 100 hectares of spare agricultural land or 300 hectares of spare agricultural land, you could use 1 for PV and reforest 299. Or you could use and get the same amount of energy as if you used all 300 for bioenergy, but you'd get 300 times the greenhouse gas reduction. Now, we have had these extraordinary estimates of bioenergy potential, and frequently in the IPCC, you'll see estimates saying, 230 exajoules of primary energy. Now, how much is that? Well, in 2000, all of the world's harvested biomass for crops, crop residues harvested, grasses eaten by livestock, and wood were about 230 exajoules. So in effect, people have been claiming that we could double the harvest of plant material, and somehow or other this would be good to the climate, even though this existing harvest of plant material is responsible for about a quarter of all the carbon in the atmosphere. And the continued production leads to even more. So when you see that, it doesn't mean that this has been exaggerated. It means somebody made a mistake. somebody made a basic accounting error. How could someone argue that the best uses of this land are to grow biomass with 1 or 2, not 1 or 2%, 0.1 to 0.2% conversion efficiency, instead of using land for other purposes, particularly when we're desperate to avoid conversion of land just to feed ourselves? And the answer is that there were accounting errors that basically double counted biomass. Now, if you go back to the 2001 IPCC report, this was their claim. They said, look, there's 3.1 billion hectares of potential arable land. We're only going to need 1.7 billion. That leaves us with 1.4 billion hectares. What if we use all of that to have high biomass yields? And the problem is that 1.4 billion hectares of land is basically the world's forests and most wettest woody savannas. And they just treated that land as free. Of course, it stores carbon. Then we see studies saying, well, look, what if we have regrowing forests? A lot of those regrowing forests, the growth is due to CO2 fertilization itself. About 10 billion tons of CO2 is being absorbed by the world's forests because of the higher carbon dioxide. We already build that into climate estimates. What if we instead use that increased forest growth for bioenergy? Yes, but by definition, that increased forest growth is sequestering carbon. So it's just double counting. What about all abandoned land? We get lots of estimates. We can just use abandoned cropland. And remember what I showed you is that for every 2 hectares of agricultural cropland expansion, 1 hectare is abandoned and already reforests and is already therefore sequestering carbon. So this abandoned cropland is not free. Additionally, grazing land in some estimates was viewed as free. There was often just calling wetter savannas other land. What if we just take wood from other uses, but it's already being used? In short, this gigantic estimate of bioenergy potential, and basically almost all the estimates of bioenergy potential, are based on counting land, biomass, or carbon that is already being used. Now, I hate to say it, but this China study we just saw is a typical example of a new kind of error. And this one is that, well, I can use land and have no cost to using that land if others reduce their land use requirements, right? So if others have diet changes, if others reduce their food waste, if others have yield gains. But the point is that those other changes will already have benefits for the climate. They will help us avoid land use change, or if not, land will reforest. So it's like claiming credit for the work of others. So if I take $100 out of a bank account, it costs that bank account $100. If others instead add $100 to the bank account, that doesn't mean that I'm not making the bank account poorer, that I'm not taking out $100. It just means others have done other things. If I don't take out $100, the bank account grows more. So none of these changes are relevant to the question of biofuels. What you have to say is we have to compare the use of biofuels in a world, if you have these changes, with or without biofuels. And if we don't have biofuels, then we will save land and we will have more land stored. So again, it is treating land as free. Okay, let me show this in a more specific way. So here's a typical life cycle calculation for biofuels. And here we have petrol or gasoline. And here's the mining emissions. Here's the refining emissions. And of course, for gasoline, they're not very high. And however, this is what comes out the tailpipe of a car. So the exhaust pipe, 73 grams per megajoule. And this was a JRC study. Well, growing the grain had more emissions, fertilizer, than just mining oil. That makes sense. Refining has more emissions. And if you actually, what you see is not only do you have this exhaust pipe emissions, but about 50% of all of the carbon in a grain is released during fermentation. And if you add all of that up, you'll get a large greenhouse gas increase. So where does the greenhouse gas reduction come from in these life cycle calculations? The answer is that they essentially assume a credit for plant growth, that the growth of the grain absorbed all this carbon. And this grain cancels out the biogenic emissions. And with that, you can get a greenhouse gas reduction. Now, the size of this reduction, therefore, depends on these numbers. But here's the critical point. It takes land to grow plants. Where's the cost for the land? Where's the cost for the land? The answer is this analysis treats land as free. We have this enormous struggle to try to store carbon, sequester carbon, natural climate solutions, avoid clearing land. We have a fixed amount of land in the world, and the typical biofuel analysis treats land as free. So here's one way to think about it. The benefit of biofuel is using land to produce plants, to displace fossil emissions, but the cost is not using land for some other purpose. And that obviously has a cost. Now, how do we measure the cost of something? Well, it's the cost of not using it in another way. The cost of any asset is what other people or you could use it for otherwise. That's the cost of using it. It's called the opportunity cost. It's maybe one of the single most basic concepts in economics. And what these typical life cycle calculations do is treat the opportunity cost of land as zero. Okay, now I actually kind of coined, I guess, economic modeling for indirect land use change, but I've come to conclude that that's the wrong way to do it. And here's why. It confuses two different analyses. One question is, what is the effect of a human activity versus no human activity? When we want to know the emissions of something, that's what we evaluate. And what an economic model tries to do is, what is the effect of one human activity versus an alternative human activity? In other words, it tries to predict if we don't do one, given a certain policy, what's the other one we're going to do? And that's a different question. And let me illustrate this. So what's the carbon cost of driving a large car? Well, we know how to do that. You look at the carbon coming out the tailpipe of the car, the exhaust pipe, use a biophysical model, say on average, and we come up with a number. So might be a typical number, 84 grams of CO2 per kilometer. Well, what if you did an economic model and said, well, what happens if we don't drive large cars? Well, it would probably conclude that we drive small cars. And let's say it's small car, the emissions are half. So, but does that mean that driving a large car only emits 42 grams, only emits half of the carbon? No. Driving a large car emits 84 grams of carbon per CO2 per kilometer. And this just means that this is the alternative that's being compared. And that doesn't tell us what the real emissions are. And in fact, if you did an economic model that way, you might conclude that driving a small car has negative emissions. Why? Because the alternative would be driving a large car. But obviously, driving a small car doesn't have negative emissions. So what's the cost of using land? The answer is not using it. And that means allowing it to hold carbon in native vegetation. Well, you can do that in two ways. So one is, if we take a typical hectare of maize land in the US and we allow it to reforest, even assuming only 3 tons of carbon per hectare per year, when you translate that into the opportunity cost for biofuels, with a very generous credit for byproducts, the cost is 150 grams of CO2 per megajoule. Well, if driving a car, this is not even counting the production emissions. This is just the land use costs. Driving a car is 74, so it's almost double. Well, what is the latest GREET model, which incorporates the GTAP model from Purdue? It claims that the land use cost is only 7.5 grams per megajoule. What's that basically saying? It's basically saying that the use of more or less the most productive farmland on the planet is almost free. The cost of using it is 5% of the value of just letting that land reforest. It's like saying the value of that land, the alternative use of that land, is having some sparse weeds. Now, what's even another way to evaluate this cost? Well, how do we evaluate the cost of any fixed input to something? Well, if you're going to make a car, you have to start by making a car factory. And to us, we know if this is significant, you should take some of the emissions of building a car factory and assign that to each car. Well, the cost of making crops includes the cost of making cropland. And that means taking this vegetation and turning it into this vegetation. And that has carbon losses. And what we should do is assign a portion of those losses to each ton of crop, and therefore to each ton of crop that is used for a biofuel. Now, if we do that and just say what on average, just on average, is the cost, the land use cost of producing a biofuel over 35 years, so 35 years of biofuels, the land use cost of producing the crops that goes into the biofuels, again, with a very generous carbon credit for byproducts. These are the land use costs. This was a paper in Nature in 2018. And for each of these crops, the gray is the cost per kilometer. And what you see is they are dramatically higher, just the land use cost, than the emissions of gasoline and diesel. And if you use solar, it's like this. So if we just say the cost of producing, the land use cost of producing, let's say the wheat that goes into wheat ethanol is the average amount of carbon we lose over 35 years to produce the wheat that goes in ethanol, that's the cost. Now, if you turn that into an ILUC number, say that's the cost equivalent to an ILUC, for those people familiar with those numbers, that's the number. And look at these numbers. They're staggeringly high. So for a biofuel to be good, since this is the number, since basically, let's say this is only the land use cost, so not even for the production emissions, the land use cost has to be a tiny fraction of the average cost in terms of the land conversion that we have to produce the crops that go into biofuels. Okay, now here's another way to say one of the problems with using these economic models. So the economic models say, hey, look, the price goes up, what happens? And one of the things they can say is, well, because the price goes up, poor people around the world will consume less food. And that gives a greenhouse gas benefit. So here's what's actually physically happening. When we grow crops, why isn't growing maize a greenhouse gas reduction strategy? What happens to it? So we're emitting all this carbon. What happens to the carbon in the maize? The answer is that people and livestock consume that carbon and emit it. And if the price goes up and people consume less, well, we still have the same amount of carbon emitted from the tailpipe of the car. We still have the same amount of carbon absorbed in land, but people and livestock consume less carbon. So instead, we're getting a greenhouse gas strategy by increasing global food prices, according to some of these models. And therefore, poor people around the world eat less, and therefore they emit less carbon dioxide. Now, this seems like a joke, except I had a paper in Science with JRC colleagues in 2015, and we showed that the US models, US government models that find greenhouse gas benefits, even within the ILUC calculation, all of the greenhouse gas benefits that they estimated came from the fact that they estimate that poor people around the world consume less food, emit less carbon, and that translates into the greenhouse gas benefit of the biofuels. I don't think that's true over more than that, very much the short term. You get this price increase that people supply, but if that were true, that's a worse result. Okay, now the other question is, can we even do credible economic models? I'm sorry, this is, so this is what you need to do that, right? Okay, let's say we just have 10 crops and livestock products. Well, we need demand elasticities for all 10. We need supply elasticities, but we need two kinds. One is the expansion elasticity. One is the intensification elasticity. If you have 10 regions, that means you need 100 demand and 200 supply elasticities. Now, one of the benefits of the models is supposed to be that you look at how changes in the consumption of one leads to changes in consumption of another. And you need 9,000 cross-priced demand and supply elasticities each. And that's before you even factor in trade. So you need literally hundreds to thousands of elasticities to do a model of this type. Now,
2 minutes, Tim.
okay. The economists know that basically to do that, you need an instrumental variable. I will go quickly since of the time. How many have been properly estimated? Almost none. Simple way to check the model results. Here is models that claim that the greenhouse gas emissions of different vegetable oils. Notice how much higher it is for palm oil. Do they have cross-price elasticities to suggest that? The answer is no. They just have simple estimates. And basically, if you look at the price of soybeans and palm oil, they move almost identically, which means that they're substitutes, which means that if you increase demand for one, you're basically increasing demand for all, which means these numbers should basically be virtually identical. Okay. So let me just finish by giving one more argument for the carbon opportunity cost of land. Why do we even have carbon accounting? Why do we have life cycle accounting? Well, it's largely because we don't have a perfect global carbon price. And what would happen if we had a perfect global carbon price? Well, we can't have it for lots of practical reasons, but it tells us what the most desirable accounting would look like. If you, let's say it's $100 per ton, let's just assume that's the perfect price. You burn oil, you pay $100 per ton. You clear forests, you pay $100 per ton. You allow forests to regrow, you are paid $100 per ton. Now, what would that mean? It means that using land to store carbon is extremely valuable, which means using land not to store carbon becomes extremely expensive. You have to forego, you either have to pay this huge amount to clear land, or you forego being paid this huge amount to reforest land. And all of the production decisions, including for biofuels, reflect this cost. Now, what's another way of saying we don't need any other accounting? This is what happened. What does that mean? It means we would be valuing land for its carbon opportunity cost. Now, we can't have a perfect global carbon price for political reasons, for practical reasons. But what this tells us is if we were valuing land properly for climate purposes, we would be valuing it for its carbon opportunity cost. And if that were the case, basically the same numbers I showed fly, biofuels would be never even thought of that involve the dedicated uses of land. So here's my summary. Extremely inefficient. The biofuel analyses in various ways have viewed land as free, double counted biofuels. The economic models are not actually what we should be using. We should be using opportunity cost. We should be looking at what is the average, at least the average cost of carbon lost to produce crops. And we should be really using the carbon opportunity cost. So thank you very much. Sorry for taking too long.
That's fine, Tim. Thank you so much for your great presentation. We don't have any questions in the box yet, so I would like to ask those who may have questions to ask them at the end of the seminar, and then we can keep to the time and have Renan's presentation. Renan, welcome. Thank you very much. Renan is from Embrapa in Brazil. He dealt extensively with land use change and sugarcane ethanol, and he will be presenting us his work. Thank you, Renan.
Thank you, Miguel. Can you see my screen?
We can, but it's not on presenters mode. I think you have to go to the bottom right of your presentation and click.
Okay. Now, yes?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Heidi, for the invitation and for the opportunity to share this webinar with such distinguished researchers. It's an honor to be here, and I prepared a presentation to try to contribute to the discussion. The ideal way would be to sleep one night after all these presentations and then prepare again. But just a joke. But I will go for the presentation I prepared. So this is about the importance of land use change, the carbon footprint of sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. Just a quick overview of the institution I'm affiliated to. I work at Embrapa, which is a federal institution in Brazil. We are widespread across the territory, and our mission is to create research, development, and innovation solutions to ensure the sustainability of agriculture for the benefit of the Brazilian society. Within Embrapa, we have an LCA research team. We are focused in developing methods, tools, and data to support the LCA of Brazilian agricultural products. And I'm dedicated to land use change modeling, aligned with LCA standards since 2015. Also, a quick overview about Brazil. Brazil is the 50th largest country in the world. Its area is close to USA and China. And at the right, you can see the distribution of different land use in Brazil. So the main difference are that Brazil has a large area of forest land still. More than half of its territory is covered by forest land. And compared to China and USA, it's a very higher share. And on the other hand, cropland and permanent pastures are small compared to China and USA. Just this quick overview. And within cropland, we have the sugarcane area. So while this is a lower area, we have 10 million hectares of sugarcane in Brazil. This is the third largest crop cultivated in Brazil. And in this area, we produce 600 million tons of sugarcane, which turns Brazil the first producer in the world. And this is used to produce three main products: sugar, in which we are first or second producer in the world; ethanol, in which we are second producer in the world; and also bagasse, which is used to produce bioelectricity, and also second generation ethanol, which is increasing in the country. All this contributes to generate 15% of the country energy matrix. Just for comparison purpose, hydropower contributes to 13%, and wind and solar to 3.5%. These are the current figures. So given this, sugarcane has been subject to lots of studies and scrutiny by the scientific community and also the policy arena. And lots of papers have been produced in studies. And within these studies, land use change is a major issue. So this is sometimes pointed at the large barrier to sugarcane sustainability, and also in some other cases as an opportunity to sugarcane sustainability. And why that? Here I present some rough average stocks, carbon stocks for different land use in Brazil. So in the right, we see natural vegetation. So you can see that the amount of carbon stock is much higher than the other agricultural land use. And in the left, we have two types of sugarcane. One generated 5 tons of carbon per hectare, and the other one 11 tons of carbon per hectare. And depending on the land use it substitutes, it can generate emissions or removals if you look in the fixed amount of time. So when converting this to grams of CO2 per megajoule and dividing this by 20 years, which is the convention in life cycle assessment, then an ethanol footprint that we would estimate an average of 26 grams of CO2 per megajoule. This could be reduced in 10 to 11 grams of CO2 if sugarcane expands over annual cropland or pasture severely degraded, or it could increase by 5 or 13, just illustration values, or even more than 100 grams of CO2 if sugarcane expands over natural vegetation land. So this is one of the reasons why direct land use change is required in the carbon footprint standards and also LCA standards. And in this context, we started to develop a method in Brazil, which is called BR-LUC, Brazilian Land Use Change method. We provide land use change CO2 emissions associated with most of agricultural products in Brazil. This is available in this website for free if you want to check it. So the main difference for the most common tools that were available since then is that we are evaluating 20 years for 64 crops in Brazil, plus planted pasture, which occupies a large amount of area in Brazil, around 180 million hectares, and also planted forest together. We treat them consistently, compatible with international standards in carbon footprint and LCA. We use spatial explicit data from Mapliomas, and we provide results for more than 5,000 municipalities. We also account for second crop intensification effects, and we use regionalized carbon stocks. So here is a map illustrating the potential carbon stock associated with native vegetation in Brazil, minus the potential of carbon stock associated with sugarcane. So this dialogues with the presentations. So if we convert 1 hectare of native vegetation to sugarcane, we can have large emissions from 32 to more than 500 tons of CO2 per hectare. This is usually divided by 20 years, but this is general overview. And we can see also the large heterogeneity we have in Brazil. But when you go for the sugarcane expansion patterns in the last 20 years, of the 10 million hectares in 2019, less than 2% came from native vegetation, 27% were pre-existent in 2000, and 52% came from pastures and almost 20% from other cropland. When we calculate emissions of those 20 years, we have this pattern in the map. So most of the sugarcane production is concentrated in the center-southern Brazil. And we can see that we have this variation from high emissions if we have recent conversions, let's say in these regions in brown, from even removals if we see these municipalities in blue. Considering this 20-year time frame. More recently, we published this study. We added some refinements to the BR-LUC 3.0 version, and we added the qualification of pasture degraded status, and we also included the effects of change the burned harvesting to mechanical harvesting, and also we adopted the sugarcane biomass and annual crops biomass alignment with IPCC. We also evaluated sugarcane area and the rural property area. So the rural property is a concept it's common in Brazil because we have a native vegetation law that establishes that each farm has to protect 20 to 8% of native vegetation. and also sensible areas, for example, riverine areas, and the remaining area could be used for production. So we evaluated the area for production and also the entire farm. This is the area of the study. So in green are the sugarcane planted areas, and in orange, the farms where the sugarcane are cultivated. And this encompassed 91% of Brazilian sugarcane. We did not analyze the northeastern Brazil, but the area of sugarcane there is declining. We excluded that because of the clouds on imagery. So the main findings in this study were that sugarcane expansion was of 6 million hectares during this period. 98.4% were over pre-existing agriculture. And in the sugarcane cultivation areas, we estimated a net carbon removal of 9.8, so minus 9.8 teragrams CO2 per year. And this was due to 55% due to the expansion of sugarcane over poor quality pastures, almost 30% due to the expansion of sugarcane over cropland and agricultural mosaics, and 16% from the change of conventional burned harvesting to unburned mechanical harvesting. When we go to analyze sugarcane producing rural properties, we have an even higher net carbon removal of 17 teragrams of CO2 per year. And this is due mainly to pasture recovery and forest recovery in these areas. So here's an illustration of where these estimated removals are concentrated. And here we compare estimates of direct land use change footprints associated with sugarcane. We see that with estimates refinement and with time, estimates are reducing and coming from positive to negative emissions or indeed removals. Taking this estimate of previously presented, converting it to grams of CO2 per megajoule, we would have minus 11 grams. And if we compare this with an average sugarcane ethanol footprint of 26, this would reduce this would reduce the footprint in 43%. And why this happened? Sorry. Okay. So some possible explanation to that are some measures that were taken by the government and the sector to reduce and avoid negative land use change. One is the agroecological zoning. This is what valid from 2009 to 2019. This is current under litigation, but it prevented sugarcane to expand over the Amazon and the Pantanal biomes. Also, the native vegetation protection law. It's a law from 1965, but it was adjusted in 2012. And this is the law that says that farms should protect 20% of native vegetation. Although there are different levels of enforcement, this is valid for the entire country. And more recently, the RenovaBio and other certification schemes that require measures to improve efficiency and zero deforestation. So I will give some more details about Brazil's biofuel policy, which is RenovaBio. This is in effect since 2017. And I will focus in this instrument. There are others in the policy, but in this regulated jurisdictional carbon market, This is a market where mandatory targets were established to fossil fuel distributors. And this is similar to California LCFS. And within this policy, the LCA carbon intensity of biofuel is calculated versus fossil fuels. And 2033 targets to have a 11% reduction in the carbon intensity of the transport matrix, which would deliver 570 million tons of CO2 avoided. And land use change is addressed in renewable by risk approaches. First, the program requires that every biomass that enters the program has zero native vegetation suppression after November 2018. And it's important to highlight that it's valid for both primary and secondary vegetation and both forest and grassland vegetation types. It also requires regular farms with the native vegetation law. Also compliance with agroecological zoning. Currently, just oil palm zoning is in effect. But if sugarcane zoning comes to be valid again, this could be incorporated and exempt residues to account for land use change. And there's also some new pledges in Brazil. So Brazil pledges to end the deforestation by 2030, which would help also addressing land use change. And more recently, Embrapa, together with other institutions, is developing a geospatial system to help to support the verification of land compliance of all rural properties inside the Renova Bio. This is to be launched in 2024, next year. So my main take-home messages are that land use change can have an important impact on sugarcane ethanol carbon footprint. And this way, direct land use change must be considered in governmental and sectoral and market policies. Other measures contribute to reduce or avoid land use change. So ensure that no expansion into native vegetation, the 20% native vegetation protection by farms, ending burned harvesting, and also sustainability certifications contribute to that. Sugarcane DLUC in Brazil, 20 years DLUC, have changed from net emissions to net removals, mostly due to expansion of the degraded pastures, and this could reduce sugarcane ethanol carbon footprint. And it also showed the importance of improving accuracy in data that can have large effects on results. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, René, also for keeping the time perfectly. We have 5 minutes for questions, and I don't see any in the box. So if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question or make a comment, now would be the time. Okay, I have a question, or a comment rather. I very much enjoy what you guys at Embrapa did, and I'm sure it will be extremely useful for policy making. So there is some indication of what the likely land use change emissions may be, which was not always the case before you started doing this work. How far-reaching do you think your work has been in terms of setting policy in Brazil?
Thank you, Miguel. Well, it's a very interesting question. Actually, when we began to work with this, it was indeed not common to have land use change accounting in the LCA of products. And we used to say that one of the main achievements of the Renova Bio policy is that everyone in the bioenergy sector is now aware of LCA and also the impacts of land use change. So this is very widespread in the bioenergy sector, and there's a growing acknowledgement of that in the overall agriculture sector. So these concepts are being very much incorporated by the people involved in decisions and in designing policies in Brazil.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear that. Do you think that the amortization over 20 years is arbitrary, or is this a good vague figure, or what do you think about that particular methodological change? Option, rather, not change.
Well, we've published a paper on that with the collaboration of Miguel. And I'd like also to highlight that Miguel was our partner in the development of the BR-Look. Thank you, Miguel, for that.
Thank you.
And my latest thinking of that is that the amortization period should be consistent with the inventory period. So if we look back 20 years ago, we should amortize this to 20 years. If we look back for 10 years, then we could amortize in 10 years. And if you look back 30 years, so on. Because if not, we can have an inconsistency in time for this accounting. And the question, I think it's important, is how these timeframes are being effective or not in changing behavior. I don't have the answer, but I think this could be investigated.
Very good question. We have 3 questions for you now in the box. What is the best model to calculate indirect land use change? And then, does sugarcane in Brazil have an impact on ILUC? And is indirect land use change applicable to agricultural or food products, or only bioenergy? Okay, not too sure it's related to your presentation, but if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, I think the previous presenter, Miguel and team, let it clear that there are lots of variation, these estimates, and some estimate negative values, other positive values, and this is an effect that can happen, but the models are have too many uncertainties on that. If Miguel wants to complement, please.
Sure. So the best model to calculate ILUC, there are various different ways of doing it. I do it in a biophysical way. The economic modeling way of tracking elasticities of supply and demand is probably the most used for policy, at least. I'm not sure it's the best for the reasons Tim has mentioned. Yeah. So if you want to, you can follow the model we produced for consequential LCA, but there will always be uncertainties associated with any model. Whether sugarcane has or not an impact on ILUC, I think it does. And is ILUC applicable to agricultural or food products or only bioenergy? It's applicable to any land use, even a parking lot or nature conservation. So there are different mechanisms. It could be market-mediated mechanisms by which land use affects the markets elsewhere. If you divert the foregone land use to a new land use, there will be gaps in the market. So if you assume a constant demand for something and that there's full elasticity of supply, then that supply will have to be met in some other way. But let's move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Deepak Rajagopal. Thank you so much, Deepak, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And let me put in screen share. Okay, it's in screen share now, correct? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you, Miguel, for this invitation, and also thank you to Heidi for all the logistical help. It's been fantastic to listen to the previous four speakers. I think we have received an excellent overview from a EU policy perspective, a life cycle analysis and modeling perspective from Miguel, a fantastic net energy and carbon opportunity cost of land perspective from Tim, and the Brazilian cane perspective. I actually, I know this is about carbon footprint of biofuels, but and I'm as a LCA person, I think biofuels are a fantastic topic because I think it's incredibly complex and has helped as LCA community really advance LCA and make it more useful tool for public policy. But I'm also an economist, and so I'm trying to provide more of a there is more than carbon, and the reason why we have biofuels is not solely carbon or even primarily carbon, and there is a bunch of other things which I think it's worth always keep remembering. It's messy. It's not so neat as carbon accounting, as complex as carbon accounting is. There is just very quickly. These are policy objectives. We might think these are legitimate or not legitimate as or some of these are political, but whether we like it or not, these objectives are real. Reduce oil consumption for reasons of energy security and volatility, develop renewable energy, develop domestic energy, support agriculture, employment generation, this is one technology or one set of technologies that doesn't require geographically concentrated minerals or new infrastructure, which is a big plus. And so we need to keep those things in mind. And different regions, policymakers in different regions place different weights on each of these perspectives. Like more environmentally enlightened policymakers may place greenhouse gas above or renewable energy above things. In other places, there may be other weights. Developing countries may have their own priorities, right? So it's really important to understand why these policies exist. And each objective, and it's important to say that none of these objectives requires biofuels, okay? Each one of these can be done without biofuels mandating them or subsidizing them. But, we can sit here as academics and say that policymakers are being inefficient or they're not being cost effective. But it's not a paradox. The policymakers don't sit in ivory towers like we academics do, right? I mean, so biofuels are simply an attractive one-stop shop option. You can be seen as doing multiple things with one policy, and there is there's a lot to be said about it. It's attractive, and a lot of us do things where we try to do multiple objectives at the same time, even if what we do is not the best for any single objective. So I think if you understand that, I think then we actually see why, where we see the problems with purely a carbon perspective. And that's what I want to provide here. Until recently, biofuels were the cheaper, simpler, mature alternative to battery electric vehicles. And I think Tim made some excellent points about the net energy. You cannot debate it. The inefficiency of biofuels there is no point in debating that it is, given that it's not energy efficient. But it is still cheaper than battery electric vehicles and hydrogen in many applications in transport. So having said that, I categorize the impacts of biofuels into three categories. The first set is those that are intended, what we intend to achieve, and we think it's a positive impact. We are achieving it, but it is hard to quantify or put a dollar value on it. So that it is renewable is indisputable, that it is domestic for many countries, if not for everybody. A lot of people, anybody with land and good climate can do it, and it stimulates agricultural economy. Okay, there is no disputing it. The only thing is it's really hard to put a dollar value if you're doing a cost benefit analysis. So there is no need to discuss this. The next set of categories are those that are intended but uncertain, and at best it is a weak benefit at best. So reduction in oil demand. Do biofuels reduce oil demand? They probably do. At least they reduce gasoline demand, even if they don't 1 unit of gasoline may not, biofuel may not displace 1 unit of gasoline, but still. But the problem with oil is that gasoline is produced in fixed proportions. When you take a barrel of oil and you refine it, you get 40% gasoline or for petrol or for 30% diesel or whatever, right? That cannot be changed too much. So if we make biofuels, say ethanol, and we do nothing about biodiesel, or if we do ethanol and biodiesel and do nothing about jet, nothing about heating oil, nothing about plastics, naphtha, you still are going to need oil. There is no point in doing biofuels, and it won't, in the sense, no, there won't be any reduction in oil. So that's the first thing to remember. They may reduce gasoline demand. Reduction in fuel price. I think this is again an increase in supply of a new alternative source should bring down the price of oil, but this is costlier to produce. So the net effect depends on the subsidies, the level of the mandate, and the market conditions of oil, and which is very complex. Oil is not a perfectly competitively supplied commodity, right? We have done a lot of work on that. And then finally, reduction in greenhouse gases. And here it's very important to distinguish two things. Like we have said, there is the own life cycle emissions, which includes the direct land use change, which is everything. And I think it's quite likely that it's lower than petrol and diesel. Okay, we can again argue about it. Indirect emissions are highly uncertain. Okay, so this is the third category of impacts. So again, there is uncertainty in all of these things, but the point is, at best, they are a small benefit. Okay, the unintended and uncertain, but likely a net increase. And what I mean by increase is a worsening. It's a cost. It's a burden. It's a harm. So it's an adverse consequence. And so I want to touch upon 4 categories of unintended and uncertain impacts that are probably net harm or uncertain. I mean, the first 2 things are a little bit more complicated. So I want to focus on agricultural commodity price inflation. I don't want to use the food price inflation word. I mean, yes, it's popular. It sounds good to talk about food price inflation, and there is probably some increase in food price inflation. But I think we need to distinguish, and I'll give you some reasons why. The next is cropland increase. And yeah, indirect land use change sounds good, and it's a very important thing that I think Sachinjar and a lot of people have introduced to the debate. It's much needed that we have that. But, land is always changing. Okay, so what is salient about biofuels? So cropland increase is a more, it's important because I think the opportunity cost of land is not just carbon. There's a lot of other things that happen, good and bad. Water depletion and air, soil, and water pollution from farm chemical use. Again, life cycle's contribution, LCA's contribution is burden shifting. And we talk so much about carbon, and this is a carbon webinar, carbon journal. But, the point of LCA is to highlight water issues and these things, which actually, there is a survey which says only 40% of papers even discuss non-greenhouse gas impacts, which is a problem. And some of those may be bigger impacts, but messier and harder because they are local things. So first, on agricultural commodity price increase. Biofuels absolutely raise the price of agricultural commodities in the short to medium run. There's no debating that, right? And we're increasing the demand for agricultural commodities. That has to raise the price in the short run to medium run. In the longer run, a lot of things can happen. Innovation can bring prices down and so on, but in the short to medium run. But impacts vary. It varies with crop, it varies with region, it varies with time, it varies for producers and consumers. And it varies between commodity prices and retail price of processed food. I'll give you some examples. There have been periods of rapid inflation, but these have dissipated rapidly. When prices rose the most, it was not solely biofuel. And biofuels are not an unmitigated disaster for commodity prices or for, So briefly, back, I did some work on price inflation. We have published some papers. We have a World Bank report that came out in 2007, 2009, just after the peak of all this. The essential things are that corn prices rose about 3-fold between 2005 and again, there are huge episodes between. So this is about 20 years, right? When the biofuel experienced a renaissance in the early 2000s. So we have about 2 years of experience. And one of the biggest price increases was between 2005 and 2007, prior to the financial crisis. So corn prices rose threefold between 2005 and 2007. Rice prices rose twofold. Soy and wheat prices rose twofold, okay, between that period. The estimates of biofuels' role in corn and soy prices, or maize, again, I'm sorry, I'm in America, so I use corn, but maize, between 2005 and 2007 is between 15% and 75%. The 75% is the highest. There's only one study that does it. It's a World Bank report, but majority of the studies, both using modeling and statistical studies, put it between 15% and 40% or 35%. Okay, but the high end is 75%. Rice and wheat are not used for biofuels. There is very little of it anywhere in the world. And also, these are not substitutes to corn or maize. It's not a substitute to sugarcane. It's not a substitute to oil seeds. So those prices need to be understood for different reasons. Economic growth, weather shocks, and trade policies. If you react badly to a situation, it's probably going to make the situation worse, which is what happens with a lot of trade restrictions, but you can understand it. Countries are very, 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 food prices are a very political thing. So a lot of these things, there's a huge literature which shows there is economic growth. All these things, currency fluctuations were big factors, and bigger factors for rice and wheat. To some extent, it is true that if you expand corn and soy, you have less land to expand rice and wheat. But again, these are not really competing, except in a few places. So, and crop prices explain a small part of food prices. I'll say why. So, okay, some empirical realities, we never really cared to look at it because talking about food makes us all feel good. We feel like we are standing up for something very important. Oh, we care about the poor, and well, none of us really who was doing this is actually right. But it feels good to talk about rising food prices. It makes us feel good. If you look at maize commodity price today, right, and this is true for then as well. It's about $5 a bushel. It's again terrible units. $4 US dollars a kilogram. Okay. If you look at bulk retail maize price, 25 kg bag, again, this is for the US, but again, maybe for the developing country, the share of grains in processed food is higher. So these shares will be a little bit higher. But let me talk about US, because corn is the biggest crop in the world for biofuels. The commodity price, the spot price, it's close to the farm gate price, in the price of bulk retail price of corn, a 25 kg bag is 2.5% today. The price of commodity in corn tortilla, which consumers buy, is 0.8%. If a household buys a 2.5 kg bag of corn grains, it's 0.4%. If you buy cornflakes, it's 0.4%. Less than 1% of your food price. You could say people buy corn. So even if you buy corn, it's 0.4%. So more work is needed in explaining the consumer food price effect. I mean, I don't think 1% increase in food price because of is something to, it cannot be, you cannot just extrapolate from when there is a 1% share. So even a doubling of corn prices will lead to a 2% or 1% increase in the price of food. If you believe that, of course, there'll be more because there is market power and so on and so forth. But the fact is, in processed food, and increasingly as people get wealthy, they consume processed food. Yes, there is some poor people who consume a lot of grains, but even for them, it doesn't explain it. Most of the modeling has been on commodity prices. And from this, we extrapolate to food prices. It's a big problem. I think there needs to be a lot more work showing how much of the commodity price is transmitted to food prices. You cannot just, extrapolate it. And even if you extrapolate it, you're ignoring the reality here. So higher food, and here's the other thing, higher food prices can be beneficial to farmers. A doubling of corn price or rice or wheat price is a doubling of revenue for a farmer. And according to this, probably it should lead to a 2 or a 3% or 4%, 5%, generous 5% increase in the price of food. Why are we saying farmers benefiting, doubling of income to farmers is worse than a 5% worsening of crop prices? Why should we care so much about food consumers more than food producers? There is a bias towards food consumers. And a lot of poor farmers, and FAO recognizes it, a lot of poor farmers, farm labor benefit from higher food prices, not to mention a lot of the other benefits of high food prices. So food prices are not an unmitigated disaster. Okay, we probably want to increase food prices because it helps you in a lot of other things as well. But of course, some people suffer. Second is cropland expansion. Biofuels will increase the demand for farmland without a doubt. But it does not necessarily mean deforestation. The first lands to be brought into cultivation will be idle farmland. It will, converting farmland, idle farmland or marginal land may increase greenhouse gases, and that's a concern. But there may also be other foregone ecological services. The Conservation Reserve Program in the US provides important water and ecosystem services, and that may be lost. And so it's not simply about greenhouse gas losses. There may be greater loss of other ecological services like water quality, soil quality, etc. It is hard to isolate the causal effect of biofuels when there are concurrent drivers, just like with food prices, economic growth, land development policies. See, all these satellite pictures say nothing, absolutely nothing about what is causing it. It's economic growth, it's land development policies. The West was developed because we wanted to settle the West. Europe and West deforested 200 years back, and now if the other regions of the world want to develop their land, more power to them, right? I mean, so we cannot sit and impose our carbon views on them, right? So we have to recognize there is land development policies, there is weather shocks, there's a lot going on. And so yes, satellite pictures look very good, but it doesn't tell you anything about what is driving it. Over time, productivity increases and land has been returned back to secondary forests. The entire US Northeast, a lot of parts of Europe are secondary forests. Yes, it may not be the same biodiversity as primary forests, but they're doing a lot of carbon then, right? So in the long run, we might recover it. Quickly, indirect land use change emissions are wide-ranging. It can be extremely pessimistic to extremely optimistic. And it's very wide-ranging. I think there was an excellent question, what model should you use? And I think Miguel gave a fantastic answer. It requires assumptions, all these, and again, Search Engine showed you, he showed there is about 2,000 assumptions, and I think absolutely right. I mean, these are models which have and he said there is at most a couple of elasticities or none is estimated empirically, and they change over time. And so none of these models have empirical basis. And so that by extension, none of these estimates have empirical basis. They cannot be verified. Anything that even if they had an empirical basis, you cannot verify them. It's not like just measuring the tailpipe pollution of a car or a smokestack. It ignores historical drivers of land use change. So median estimates suggest biofuels are not more GHG intensive than oil, even if you use land use change. So if policymakers want to say, give me a number for ILUC, you can choose a model which will give you a low ILUC. So we can find models and we can say that, 50% of the models give you low ILUC. And maybe that may be true, that may not be true, but who is to say? So this is tough. This is not easy. And so if there is ILUC, there is also IFUC. I don't want to pronounce it like ILUC. You can pronounce it yourself. I wrote a paper.
2 minutes.
Sorry.
2 minutes, Deepak.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I know it's if there is just like ILUC, there is IFUC. It's the effect of fuel use change. Biofuels raise fuel prices. When they raise fuel prices, they reduce fuel consumption. That leads to additional emission reduction. So just like Search Engine said, a lot of the emission benefits come from people eating less. If a very similar extension, if people drive less, that's a benefit. So no policy today takes IFUC into consideration. And just to be a little irreverent here, there is also potentially IFUC too. You can pronounce it yourself. It's indirect fertilizer use change. The point is not that we should ignore ILUC, but if we do ILUC, there's a lot of other things. So we can create a full employment act for people like us and keep writing a lot of papers. And so water, very quickly, water footprint is extremely important. There are 70% of global fresh water is for agriculture. I think that's a serious concern. We don't talk about it much. Farm chemical inputs, again, this is the biggest cause of eutrophication. So there's something called salience. biofuels or agriculture contributes more to these causes than carbon emissions. So we should target these things, is what I'm trying to say. Summary, economic and political reality is we need liquid fuels. First gen is not the cleanest, but simple and mature. Second gen, costly, slow technical progress, needs R&D. Food price effects are overstated. Cropland expansion is a concern, but there is no empirical evidence that there's no empirical evidence for it, that it's how much of it is caused by biofuels. So the noble thing, the feel good thing is to say biofuels from crops don't sound good, and that may be right environmentally, but it's better to say that than justify it on the basis of numbers from models that are not suited for this. We need to use carbon accounting carefully, and this is the last slide. I'm sorry. I think we should, if we need these multiple objectives, there is a role for biofuels, but we need to ask the question: what is the best use of land? I think I agree completely with Tim there that there's an opportunity cost to land, but where I don't agree is the opportunity cost is not just the carbon opportunity cost. It's the opportunity cost, period, which is carbon with one of the opportunities. So we need to look at the overall picture. Okay, and we need to use more of life cycle based standards. Indirect emissions needs to be addressed better. But I think overall, we need to make agriculture less harmful. I think that's the whole thing. And we need to target land policies. A bunch of papers, the touch one and nature energy one, and you can look at it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Deepak. Very useful summary. The floor is open for the audience. We don't have any comments or questions in the comment box, I don't think, other than what are the challenges for the production of biofuels in Tamil Nadu in India. I'm not sure if...
Okay, I'm from India in Tamil Nadu. I did a little bit of work like long time back, so it'll be immodest of me to say what has happened in the last 15 years. But again, I would say as somebody who with Tamil Nadu and all the political issues with water, with Tamil Nadu grows 2 or 3 rice crops a year. Water is a huge concern, and I guess essentially I think in water scarce areas it will be irresponsible to grow biofuels. So I think in water scarce regions, water has to be the primary concern, and so to the extent we can use residual biomass or use and again, there's the bioenergy may be a better option than biofuels in a lot of places because you have biomass. And so I think it goes back to what is the best use of land. Yeah, I think I'll stop there because I can't say anything.
Thank you. I have another question. What would it take to understand the causality for the remote sensing observation that land clearing is increasing?
Yeah,
what type of needed to understand the driver?
Important question. I guess I'm not a remote sensing person, nor am I an econometrician. I know a little bit, but you need to combine econometrics. Try to use the most sophisticated of how do you isolate the non? Again, for the reasons we received, the mechanisms by which ILUC happen, like Miguel said, right? It may not be directly the crop what is pushing it, right? If you obviously are planting in those remote sensed areas, if the growth is happening in biofuel crops, that is a clear indicator. But even that, again, how much of that is due to increase in demand for the crop due to economic growth, rising income, demand for meat. So we absolutely need those studies, but I think we need to go beyond those studies. And I think this is where my pet peeve about data science is progressing very fast because of computational capacities, but our theoretical and our conceptual capacities don't grow that fast. And so we need a lot more work on what kind of models are we applying to those data. So I think more work needs to be done there.
Thank you very much, Deepak. Before we proceed with the last presentation by Hans, I would like to open the floor for any questions you may have for Tim. Tim has to leave us soon. So if anyone would like to ask him a question or make a comment on what he presented, you're welcome. And if not, I know Tim had a comment for Renan.
So yeah, I'll just make a few comments and thank you for this opportunity here. I mean, I think the Brazil presentation highlighted the fact that if you're not focusing on opportunity costs, you're just missing everything. The sugarcane land in Brazil is much of the best agricultural land in the world. Globally, half of sugarcane is produced using irrigation. And so the cost of devoting that land for biofuels has enormous costs in terms of the food production we could be producing, therefore avoiding the need to continue to clear land. So I just was going to mention that. On just brief comments on some of the price discussion. The reason we clear land is because of a price signal that it's profitable to clear land. And so anything that increases the price is going to do that. If you want people to stop clearing land, you're going to have to basically lower the price. And that's basically how markets work, to send a signal to produce more. And in the absence of proof that you're actually increasing yields as a result of these higher prices, it is going to be land clearing. And if you look back at the last 20 years, there is precisely zero evidence that any of the crops that are being used for biofuels have had higher yield gains than their historical trend rates. You may get little blips here and there, but not over time. So we have literally no evidence that this is being done by yield gains. But even apart from that, there's only so much capacity for yield gain. And when you talk to the agronomists, and even putting aside biofuels, and you say, how are we going to actually increase yields at a sufficient rate to feed everybody without land use change, which is a presumption of every climate strategy, they're almost in despair. It's not like there aren't theoretical things we could do, but in terms of actually accomplishing it. So biofuels have to come on top of that. So the biofuels would only be beneficial if you had yield gains in excess of those needed already to avoid land use change for food production. And, there's just no evidence of that. So therefore, this idea that land use change is somehow theoretical, no, you're using land, therefore we will have more land. And just the last thing I'm just going to say is about BECCS. So now we have this kind of interest in BECCS, but the whole presumption that BECCS is better than just applying carbon capture and storage to fossil fuels is based on the assumption that the biomass itself is carbon neutral. So when you correct for that error, there's no reason to get a benefit from BECCS. It's not negative. It's just applying CCS. And because you actually need a lot more energy, a lot more biomass, it's a real problem. And the last statement, I'll just say this. When academics started inventing BECCS, and it was, as Michael Obersteiner says, it's the first technology that was invented by modelers. And what they were basically saying is, let's imagine a future in which we've done all these other things and we have a decline in agricultural land use, and we can devote this land to energy crops. And if we get high enough yields on energy crops, it's better than reforesting the land if we can use it for BECCS. And all of which is true, although only a little bit better than just reforesting the land. But that presumes you have surplus land and you have these extremely high yields and extremely high capture rates. And what's happening now instead is people are planting BECCS just by cutting down forests. And just one number I'll just offer on that is that when you cut down a forest and turn it into wood pellets and then put it to a power plant, about 2/3 of the carbon is lost and not captured. So more than half of the carbon is either lost either in the forest itself or in turning wood into wood pellets. And then you have to burn more stuff to do the CCS. And even if you get an 85% capture rate, at best, you might be getting like 35% of the carbon stored. So you're emitting at least 65, probably more like 75% of the carbon. And nobody who was originally modeling BECCS thought you were just going to cut down trees and burn them. It was all based on these kind of future assumptions about the surplus of land and extremely high energy crop yields. So that's kind of the real threat, I think, right now in Europe is this kind of misapplication of this kind of concept. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to go. I really appreciate listening to everybody else, and I'll look forward to kind of catching up with Hans's presentation afterwards.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your great contribution to our seminar.
Thank you.
All right, so let's have Hans' presentation now. Sorry, Hans, to keep you waiting there for a bit. Hans is from Biomass Research. He's also from the International Energy Agency Bioenergy, Task 45, I do believe. And Hans will talk to us about indirect land use change and different views on the topic. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
I think Hans is just starting.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. And I really enjoyed the presentations. It's too bad that Timothy has to go. I appreciate a lot of what I've heard. Deepak, I really agree with you. Fresh water and water is very important. So it's much more than land alone. Okay, so let's see. I'm an agronomist, so I'm not gonna show models I developed or economic models or things that I've done. What I've been looking at is if it would be possible to see what indirect complications, indirect effects of biofuel production increase in the US could be captured, especially when it comes to land use change. So this is a slide presenting, let's say, not the mess, but let's say the situation where we're in. There's a real lack of consensus. The data and the tools are maybe, well, they're not complete and they're not covering the situation to the extent that we want. So there's all kind of issues with ILUC assessment, especially ILUC modeling. So that is one question. What model would you use? And one of the answers was, I think, given by Deepak, depends on the answer that you want. So I don't want to be cynical. So I'm just going to a situation where we're going to look at, let's say, a real world data and projections to that, and then compare the outcomes. So if we look at the framework that we're going to use today, you can see if we have a biofuel policy leading to increased biofuel production, in this case, ethanol in the US, you need more crops. So we all agree on that. And we have heard a lot about crop prices. If you have a higher demand, then the price will go up. No economist will disagree with that. As a consequence of the higher prices, in many cases, it's projected that there are changes in the global markets. And in this way, in this case, I'm going to present it very simplified, that assuming the US would have higher internal crop prices, especially corn prices, then their exports would go down. So that would have a trade impact, and other countries would step into that, as Timothy said, because what you do is you take a decision, hey, we can make more money because there's a higher demand. In this case, that would be leading to deforestation in Brazil. What is not really in many of the analysis is this part, and this is in blue, and this is the internal dynamics that we find in the US. Animal feed market is one, because corn is mostly used for feed, but also internal changes that you could have in land use. I'm going to discuss a little bit more on that. So what are we doing? I'm going to compare basically two narratives. One saying, okay, increased demand is going to lead to a shock, price shocks, as I said, capital land markets will be involved, will be affected, higher prices that have been mentioned before, and that will in the end result into changes in, let's say, the global crop production and especially the land markets. So there's a difference, there's a clear distinction between products like corn in the case of the harvested area and the crop area, including the forest or let's say the land cover. I'm coming back to that. Yeah. So this is the most let's say the dominant narratives, and we have named it the trade and market response narrative. So there's an impact in trade and markets. There's also a narrative that is more focusing on the, let's say, the technical part and the internal dynamics of, in this case, the US food and feed production and use system. So that is defining that we have more changes than only just the biofuel. So it's broader, and there is also including preferences, population. And then you can see the response is also more dynamic. And it assumes, I think, a higher dynamic character and a higher capacity to adjust. And we're going to see more of that, and then you can conclude for yourself. So elements of this narrative are that there is an opportunity in the crop production system, in this case in the US, for example, to increase cropping intensity. I'm going to explain to you what it is. But also we're going to have options to invest more in the infrastructure, which also can have an impact, and crop rotations can change. So these are two narratives that are basically opposing each other. They cannot be, let's say, followed in the same time. But I think the extremes but are interesting enough and they're helpful for us to understand what the models and the papers are projecting and what we can see in reality. So I'm going to compare a few model studies, including searching. I'm sorry, Tim is gone because I would like to have his response, and no doubt he will find me afterwards. Also, work from the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute in Iowa, FAPRI, and consequential LCA models like Miguel has been working on for a lot of his time, and as he is presenting so well. So we're going to look at basically mostly of the papers, they follow this trade and market response narrative, which, as I said, is like dominant over the other internal adjustment narrative. I'm going to focus on price effect and trade because these are basically the instruments that we need if we want to have a transfer from changes and responses in the US to the global market. And I'm going to focus on Brazil, but that's just a simplification, as I said. In the end, I'm going to present some time series and observation data. So important for us and important for me to explain to you is what would be the route, how the domestic change in the US following the policy and the increase in ethanol production, how could that be translated to any land use change in Brazil? We know, yes, price, but we need a more clear instrument for that, and that will be the trade. So if we compare both approaches, again, trade and market response, they have a really, they make an adjustment estimation. These are usually done in advance or ex ante model studies. What would be the impact if we would change a policy like this? Then you can see that the ethanol and corn demand would, ethanol production corn demand would increase. That would lead to a shock price changes would have, and then would have changes and corrections in markets and exports. I've mentioned it before. The internal adjustment narrative studies, they tend to have a lower projection of the expansion, so they're a bit more conservative, and they focus on the flexibility and crop and livestock production and use, not only production, but also the use. How are we going to use it, and what will be the impact of that? So if you look at these studies, they predict some land use changes, but not so much as in the other narrative, and also changes in land efficiency. So there's mitigation internally. What is important here is that as we look at the carbon impact of biofuels, the question is, how does these changes, how does this story affect the carbon effects? I think we could talk a little bit more on that. So I'm going to show you a few studies. So this is from the FAPRI model. As I said, I'm not going to lay out all the details of this work. It has been published by IEA Bioenergy as a co-production of multiple task groups. I just want you to focus on the blue part, which is the trade. So you can see here, this is a projection that was done, I think, I'm not sure, I think it was 2009, and they said most of the changes, most of the demand, let's say the generation of corn that is needed to produce the ethanol, but will come from an area increase and some yield effect. These together, they make up 55%. And trade is interesting. There's hardly any change in trade. Here they say 0.7 million ton a change in the corn trade as a result of the increased biofuel production. So this is the Searchinger paper. This is a totally different picture. You can see here on the left that the trade is much more important. You can see on the right in the table, there's a decline that is projected for corn export, for wheat export, soybean, you name it, also livestock production. And this is all because in the domestic change in the US system, corn will become more expensive. They lose their position on the world market, and also livestock production based on the corn will also be more expensive. So that is basically the core of this projection as it was published in 2008. Miguel has also presented this work very well. You see, it's not so high, but still a trade is affected. This is another study, and interestingly enough, they do follow the trade market response, but they expect less trade effects. It's all yield. So this is also an option. You don't see this too much, but it's interesting to see that there's a diversity of that. And of course, this will have implications. And this is what we have seen, what we see if we look at the statistics. So as a result of the introduction of the biofuel policies in 2005, this is a 10-period window that we are evaluating, we see an increase of corn use by 92 million tons, which is basically similar to most studies. Searching was projecting a little bit more, Flug a little bit low. So there's a variation, but there's not so much difference, although there still is a difference, but the most important difference is when it comes to the exports. And what we see, so what we have seen, and I will show you the data, is that although the corn price went up, especially on the short term, as it was projected in one or two of the earlier presentations. Thank you for that. It was really good to look at that. You could see some changes in the internal use of feeds. Also, you could see that the DDGS production output was also used to compensate for that. And as a result, the net export decline was very, very small. So although we can see that the corn production in Brazil has gone up in these same periods, there's no trade impact here. So we cannot say that the Brazilians have stepped in where the US stepped out. Okay, this is some trend lines just to show you what we see. The corn area indeed is increasing. It is quite a lot, but it's very difficult. I'm sorry, I flagged out the years. There is a bit of increase early after 2005, but on the whole, we cannot say that it is a permanent, because it basically adapted to the long-term trends. So this is for corn, but when we look at the lower figure, you see that the cereal area in the US is declining. So it's going up, but it's certainly not increasing, and especially not increasing to the same extent that the corn area is expanding. So this means that corn is increasing in cultivated area, but it is going partly at the extent of other crops, other cereals, that is. Here we see an overview of the prices, the price fluctuations, and the exports. You see that after 2005, there has been a price increase. Then it went down, but the real spike was in 2012, where there was a drought situation. And you can see the price there are really going up and down, because after the spike in 2012, as I said, because of the drought, you could see that it came back to a level in 2016 to 2017, which is more or less in line with the long-term trend. So I did not compare this to other type of price changes, and I would be really interested to see to compare this to the price index, but unfortunately I had no time to do it. More important and more interesting is what we see in the changes in the import and export. So the export is the highest, of course. Import changes so much, but basically the only substantial import was in 2012 and 2013. When we look at the export, you can see that following 2005, the export did not decline. It did increase, and at the first point, and only in 2010, it was at the same level basically that it was before the introduction of the biofuel policies. So although there was a price effect, and you can see there was a price hike, it was some correction, and then but maybe it was beyond what was, let's say, the trend line. You could see that this price effect was not translated into a decline of the exports. And this gives us a bit of a dilemma. Yeah. So although we know that the price has been changed, we cannot say that this price effect has been transferred to other markets because there was no dip in the trade volumes. And we can look at other products as well, and I've done that, but I've just focused on corn. I think the elephant in the room is one: what happens here in this land, in this area. So is this flexibility? Is there one of a time occasion? We looked at 10 years, and we looked at the US only. Do we also have this flexibility in the EU? Do we also have it in other countries? I think we do, but I did not check that. And also, I think what is more important is, do we really understand in our project, let's say, economic studies and the trade studies, do we really understand what is going on? This is one of the figures I think that has been really helpful for me. What you see here on the right, you see barley. And you can see that the barley average harvest in the US in around 2010 is 3.9 ton per hectare. What we see is over the period that we are looking at, that barley and other soft cereals are being replaced partly by corn. And if you look at the corn yield, which in the US is an average of close to 10 ton, that is a very interesting situation, because then if you take out the ethanol, which would then be around 5.7 ton per hectare, equivalent of the, let's say, of the weight, you would still have DDGS that is a potential, a very strong animal feed, which is higher than the barley yield. So this is one example, but it is very relevant, as I said, because the cereal area is declining, which means that maize is increasing. It would be interesting to look at the water effects of that. I don't know that, but as I said, I agreed with Deepak. That is, I think, something that is quite revealing and neglected. This is some old data that I took. This is between 2000 and 2010. I think what is important here, when we look at the changes in agriculture area over this period, you see that over a time period of 10 years, there is a loss of almost 50 million hectare of agriculture area. This is agriculture cover. So I understand that agriculture has been monitored to expand, but is also losing area. And this land is going to other sectors. So when it comes to a carbon price or a carbon impact, my question is, would not this carbon, the loss that is caused by this land loss, has to be borne by other sectors rather than agriculture, because agriculture is losing to tourism, it is losing to transport, it's losing to urban areas. So basically, if we are claiming that agriculture should be in some way attributed to the carbon loss, I think we should look beyond that, because this also would be a consequential LCA issue in my personal opinion. The second row after that is the second row to the right is also very revealing. You see that over this period, although almost 50 million hectares were lost, this is area, the increase of cropping intensity has generated more than double the area. So on a, let's say, on a balance base, you see that the area that is available for food crops over this period has increased. It has not reduced, even although almost 50 million hectares of agriculture area was lost. So agriculture has been shrinking, but the harvested area has been increasing. And you can see on the left that is quite revealing. I don't have the recent data, but I think it is still there. Okay, so I'll try to bring a few messages for the discussion. The model projection that's still leading to conflicting results. So I think that is very clear. We got two narratives. They have contradictory findings. We have done analysis for the US. I would be very happy to see this for China, for example, and or for other countries, other regions. So please contact me if you want to do this type of analysis. Yeah. If we look at, I'm going to skip this. So you can look at other studies done by the IEA. these are some other considerations. We have a lot of uncertainty into the ILUC factors. And there's a tendency to use generic ILUC factors that has also been presented over here. This is a warning. We want to warn against that because there's really a strong variation. We have just shown that over this 10-year period in the US, the indirect effect, let's say the propagation of the internal effects to other markets could not be found. It doesn't mean they are not there. Maybe they are there, but there's still we have found no evidence of this mechanism, like a change in trade volume has been occurring. So again, hypotheses and policies of effects of policy, they must be, I think, tested more strictly. We use the trade models too easily, maybe, and there's certainly not enough, let's say, warnings about how to use and what the interpretation should be done on the outcomes of that. I don't say that models are not good, but it was mentioned before, our models are not good. Some are useful, but I think they're only useful if you use them in the context and if you explain to the people who are looking at the outcomes how you got at it and what are the limitations of that. There's also a call for to engage stakeholders in more, let's say, place-based approaches. But I think this is basically the gist of what we wanted to produce, what I wanted to present to you. There's a need for variable data. That's very clear. I'm very fond of using long-term data trends and to try to look for changes in that and to see to test if really things are different because of this policy. I think we are still away from being where we can to predict the changes. So if we cannot look forward with sufficient certainty, let's look back and see what happens. Yeah, and then we can use this to measure policy effects. It is very interesting also to do causal analysis. I had no time to work on that, but our colleague Debo has done excellent work of this in the US. One important thing is that land management and land cover are totally different. Not every area ton or every hectare that is harvested means an expansion of land cover. That is really something that is too simple. And as an agronomist, I really have a problem with that. So let's see if we can get more consistent and more transparent approaches to see we get more standard terms, definitions, baselines, and scenarios to quantify the effects. I think that's it, basically. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hans. Very nice to hear your presentation. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left in which some of these topics can be explored a little further and discussed. Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? Start us off. No? You all agree? Okay, maybe related to Hans' presentation, I think there were two things that stood out that I think were interesting perhaps to explore. The first was that globally, as Hans pointed out, with reference to national statistics, the area for cereals seems to be declining. So therefore, any expansion of croplands onto that declining cereal land would basically not entail a carbon cost. So the question, I think, is, should we compare whatever biofuel we may be analyzing that expands onto other land, should we compare it to the previous crop that would not exist anymore because there's no demand for it, like aggregated cereals, or should we compare it to a situation where the land would be left to regenerate and soak up all that carbon? Because it does really make a difference in the carbon footprints results that you would get.
You know, Miguel, I have a problem with leaving it, let's say, taking it like that, because the land that's currently used is owned by somebody. So if you would, let's say, we want to regenerate or we want to leave it to rewild, then you would have to compensate the owner for that. There's a price for that as well. And if you just assume that we got carbon extra sequestration because of it, but you don't take into account the cost that you have to pay for it, then I think this is a very expensive option for carbon sequestration. I would prefer that we see that we compensate farmers who do manage to increase the soil carbon while cultivating, or even making it, keeping it fallow. We compensate for that. We need a good carbon market, and there are, in my view, two options apart from CCS to sequester carbon, to have carbon negative production change, and these are in forestry and these are in agriculture. And I always try to advocate for the farmers, because in many cases farmers, they suffer, they don't make really much money. I see this in Africa, but I also see in Europe, and this is the reason why they do upscaling and why they are so intensive. So why not use this money? If you want carbon sequestration, compensate farmers for doing that, monitor the carbon that is stored in the soil, and don't go the rewilding version, because that is really quite dramatic and very, very expensive. Thank you.
That is a good point, and I think carbon farming initiatives are sprouting everywhere, which is probably good. But how do you actually account for the financial compensation farmers would have to get for storing carbon? Do you compensate it on a flux basis, so for every 10 sequestered, or do you compensate them for every 10 stored? So every year, even if you don't change your stock in your farm of carbon, you would still get a payment for keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere. That's a good question.
You want to answer? Can I answer, or maybe Horst can? But I have an answer. Horst, you go first. No.
Horst, would you like to, or maybe Hans?
I agree with you. So
Sorry,
I think
just
it's very
came
simple.
back, and I haven't got the.
Hans, maybe you would like to have a go.
It's very simple. I think the major problem we have is over the next 10 to 15 years. We really need carbon capture, and then I think we're really in much safer water when it comes to the current, let's say, the technologies that we then have to produce with low carbon impact. So maybe 10 or 20 years carbon negative. So if you do compensate for farmers, you must have an arrangement about the time that they keep it in the soil. So not just say, okay, you have done it for 1 year, but you must pay a price, and then you can put it maybe like, this is a bank for 10 years or a bank for 20 years. And I think a bank for the first 10 years, I think that would require the highest compensation price, because it has the highest impact, I think, in terms of the climate change.
Yes, I mean, there's so much uncertainty around bio-based carbon or biogenic carbon, how much there is of it, how much soil actually sequesters, the impact of different farming practice on soil organic carbon and all of that. But certainly if there was a well-functioning carbon market, farmers could take benefit from it. We have a question to IFEO, Horst, about the different estimates of biofuel impact and remote sensing showing expansion of land clearing. There's always an issue of causality here. And the point that we don't know the causality and the role of biofuels, how are the EU values obtained? What empirical studies could be done to untangle the causality for ultimately policy purposes? Lisa is asking. Horst, are you there?
Yes, so hopefully you can hear me, because I'm at a train now. Sorry, I had to move and to get at home still at night. And yeah, I think yeah, it shows that there are really different intentions for the carbon counting and carbon calculation, footprinting. Since I think the idea of the RED calculation is not originally really not to see what is the overall benefit or impact of biofuel use, production and use. It's more or less saying, okay, we agree there's let's say at a priori agreement. It is good. It is not very good. It's good for savings. And now let's see what each single operator can gain. And the problem then is to see what's actually happening on ground that does not really correspond. And that's what I meant at the beginning, that the calculation, the rules in there and the thinking behind has some intention towards getting improvements on chains, on production chains, but it's not really telling the truth about what's really happening in terms on climate, on greenhouse gas emissions and savings and all these things together. And that's why also it might be complicated to consider things like remote sensing, looking really what's happening on land clearing and so far, because that is one truth we really find out there. And the other side is that policy, I think policy already also learned something about that. When we see, maybe when I described the activities in the RED and the RED 2 and 3, I was not broad enough maybe to say also that it is already somewhere yes accepted that cropping, using crops, agricultural crops for uses for biofuel might not be the very best idea, and that's why they invented the capping. So there's a cap, and member states of the EU are even open and to reduce, to lower the cap. And many countries already think about that, lowering the cap towards something like 0% in 2030 might be the right reaction to see that not from the calculations under the RED, but informations that have been given also today by several presenters show that, yeah, this information has to enter into the policy decisions. And I think in a way it arrived, but not on the calculation rules I've presented in the very first presentation this day. Maybe this is helpful for the answer. I'm not 100% sure whether I got it. Sorry.
Yes, it is, Horst. Thank you very much. And I know Deepak would like to say something here too.
I think on the causality part, there is not much econometric work, but there are two good papers. One by Katie Hausman and Max Offhammer, back from 2009, 2008. I've seen their NBER working paper version, where they estimate the price elasticity, the land elasticity of in Brazil in response to sugarcane and biofuels. And that is one paper. It's a very rigorous econometric paper looking at, okay, what is the effect of an increase over, they look at a 20-25 year panel and identify carefully what is the impact. And they find that the sugarcane price land elasticity, I don't recall the exact numbers, but that there is one paper that you can look at which points to that. And there's another by Wolfram Schlenker. There's a bunch of papers by Wolfram Schlenker and Roberts, which appeared in PNAS and a bunch of things, where they actually identify what is the effect of biofuel mandates on crop prices in an econometric way, not using like multi-market equilibrium models, and they actually estimate the elasticities, which these models should be using. So it's a primary research estimating. And if you look at their estimates, they actually estimate a food price effect of 20%. So what we can do is, if we have a causal price estimate of 20%, you can then extrapolate to increase this 20%. How much will, if you want to increase your, in response to a 20% increase in prices, you can apply elasticity. You can bound it and get some estimates. So if at least somewhere, either what is the effect on prices and what is then translating the effect of prices into effect on land use change, if at least we have one of them causally estimated, especially the price effects causally estimated, you can put some bounds. And then the third step is, what is the carbon value of that? But again, all of these things only show holding all else fixed. And it still doesn't answer, ultimately, did it lead? Because I think if you paid attention to what Hans said, there is actually land reduction happening somewhere as well. So it still does not mean actually land expanded. But if you think that land could have been put to nature, then it gets complicated. But that's one approach to do it, is you have to do something econometrically. That's the only way you're going to get causal effects. And it's not easy.
Yes, indeed. I think what remote sensing can tell you is the sheer amount of land that is being converted, but it will never tell you anything about causality. But what we do know is that even if we don't have any direct causality, for example, if you have existing croplands for foods, let's say you're growing corn or maize, and you turn it to biofuels, there's no direct land use change. And that's what the remote sensing would tell you. But then at the frontier, indirectly, some land will be converted to probably make up for the foregone supply of food crops. But to establish that causality is, of course, very, very difficult. We have one question here by, where was it? By Coffee, who's asking us about, is there a baseline use of land? Because it will affect how we determine the opportunity cost. Absolutely. So if your baseline is also cropland, then there will not be any difference in carbon stocks. So depending on the baseline you adopt, you will have different results when you compare your system against that baseline. And that's why if you just assume that land will be left to regenerate naturally and absorb all that carbon, then the carbon footprint of using that land for any other purpose would be severely taxed. And perhaps that's the appropriate way of accounting. I'm not entirely sure. We have a few more minutes. Yeah, sure.
Just want to add to that. One, I think the baseline is important, but like you said, you can also do something with the land. So the opportunity cost is, what is the next best use of land? So the current use may be idle and it may be providing carbon, and there is certain carbon value to it. But the opportunity cost asks the question, is the best leaving it as it is or doing something else? And so the baseline is important, but again, it's not necessarily the current baseline is the best use of land as well. So you have to look at all the things you can do with it.
That's right. Land is finite, and we want a lot of things from it, especially with this renewed interest in the bioeconomy. Okay, would Hang Sheng or Renan would like to say something? I'm not sure if you're still with us, but Renan, hi. Would you like to comment on any of the things we've been talking about?
Sure. Thank you very much, you all, for the very interesting discussion. And regarding Dean's comment, I think an important aspect of that is really about the financing, the finance behind maintaining natural vegetation. So we have lots of forest areas in Brazil, and just in the last few years, we have some money to preserve this natural vegetation. So it would be very important if more money is provided for maintaining this vegetation, because this is a simple analysis the owner of the land is doing. How much I'll get to preserve that versus using for another use.
That's such a good question. It goes back to what I was saying about being compensated for keeping a carbon stock, even though there may not be additional flows. For example, if you have tropical forests as part of your farm or your property, should you be compensated for doing nothing, essentially for just keeping the stock, even though it may not be increasing and acting as a sink? It's difficult to account for stock flows when you talk about carbon, but also finances.
Exactly.
Hans, would you like to say something about any topic you'd like before we close?
Well, I worked for 10 years at the Economic Institute, and one of the things we would like to do is see prices, let's say negative effects that we call externalities. So we see that included in the price, so that when somebody is consuming something or producing something, they know, oh, this is the price I have to pay because there's some kind of negative effect elsewhere. If we would have that, so we don't have it, but if we would have that, and I think I would like to go there for carbon. So if we would have a carbon price included, that would, I think, help a lot. My assumption is that if we go that direction, we would solve two things. I think farmers would be encouraged and compensated for, but also encouraged to increase, let's say, the carbon stocks. But there would also be let's say, more accounting on this. And my assumption and my hope is that it would also help us to solve this really dilemma about indirect land use change. Because basically anybody who is doing something which affects the carbon stocks on or below the soil would then have to account for that. So I'm not trying to be visionary or say this is where we have to be in an ideal situation. But I think if we could take small steps to start to realize that, to go in that direction, I think that would help a lot. I work on biogas projects, and what I see now in Africa is that basically an installation for a smallholder family with 2 or 3 cows, they can produce enough biogas for themselves. So that is really small. That is too expensive in many cases. Only when we have dairy farmers, then they have a contract with a milk factory, then they can get the credits to buy it. The cost of this installation is around €500 or $500. What I also see is that more and more there is getting carbon market and trade of carbon credits based on the performance or the elite's performance or the expected performance of these smallholder installations. And I think that is a really good case. And a biogas installation, I think carbon credits are simpler and easier to understand and easier to trade and to monitor than soil carbon. But if I look at the EU policy now, take the step to the common agricultural policy in the EU, we see that catch crops, for example, are encouraged. We see buffer strips are encouraged. And also we see globally that, let's say, zero-till is increasing. I don't think it is really important, but especially in Mercosur countries, I understand, and in the US, it's quite common to do on zero-till. So one of the first steps I see is that we try to identify the carbon impact of this, what is already going on, either biogas installations anywhere, but also zero-till or catch crops, additional crops. So in this case, I do not agree with Timothy. It's too bad he's not here, because when we introduce an extra crop, and I'm just doing the calculations myself, not the carbon calculations, but we can introduce catch crops in a crop rotation in Europe, in Latin America, in the US, where there is no crop in between the main crops, so after a cereal crop. Then you have an extra crop which is having an extra impact on the soil carbon. And if we start to compensate that, and then we need to quantify that, and I think that is a good start. And one of the major extra advantages or pluses of that is that it could reduce the runoff. And the runoff, as you know, is not only bad because you get eutrophication acidification, but also you lose valuable soil, topsoil, but also your infiltration capacity of the soil will increase. So I'm an agronomist and I like to do the calculations. I like to do the math. And we look at these systems in their entire, let's say, the entire situation. We look at mass balances, we look at water balances, and we look at nutrient balances, but also at carbon balances. So I see that the science is improving, the demand for the data is there. I don't see why we could not solve this issue of monitoring soil carbon. I know there's a high uncertainty, but I think if you go to the monitoring of the tillage and let's say the agricultural practices, then I think we could make a solid case. And this is very encouraging. What I see in Eastern Europe is we have a company that I follow. They have an app for farmers to monitor their activities in terms of plowing, harvesting, and treatment and soil treatment. They do that to help the farmers, and the farmers buy this app to become more efficient in terms of logistics. But the sheer amount of data and the type of data that they are collecting, I think, are a useful source. And you see also the big tractor companies like John Deere. They collect the data of the farm machinery use by default. So I think the data are becoming available, and I think there's a good room for that. And then I think we can solve the gap that is now here.
Yes, thank you for that, Hans. Of course, that any decline in yields because of low tillage or shallow tillage would have to be taken into account as well. Just before we finalize, we have a question from the audience asking whether there are any mandates by the countries on shifting towards third generation or algae biofuels to mitigate carbon emissions. Maybe, Horst, you know about the European case?
Yeah, it's let's say the expression third generation is not really existing in the EU legislation, but algae are, let's say, subsumed under what's feedstock for advanced biofuel, and there are mandates. There are obligations of 7%, something around in 2030 in the fuel, which is, let's say, overall, if you take into account what we have today, it's an ambition, and the ambition is also supported by high penalties. So we have to pay, for instance, in Germany, it's about, that's it, around 400 euros to pay per ton of CO2 you don't meet by under, let's say, the necessity to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by transport fuels, by also advanced biofuels, and that triggers. I think that should trigger a lot of starting up, ramping up, also things like algae production, which could be in there. But point might be there is still. So I know a number of LCAs for algae biofuel production, which still have some, by, let's say, for the time being, by high energy consumption, not that positive greenhouse gas balance. So if you can refer more and more to renewable electricity and energy provision for that, and also improve your whole reactor systems for algae, then that could, of course, might then have also really might play a role. But let's say there's a competence with other fuels, with other feedstocks for advanced biofuels, such as straw specifically, wood residues and things like that, that altogether have a large potential in there. And so as long as, let's say, the obligation could be met by, for instance, by straw bioethanol or biomethane from straw, then there's a very low incentive to ramp up algae production for that. That's as far as the European legislation is covering that.
Okay, Horst, thank you very much. We are now 10 minutes beyond the estimated closing of the webinar, so I would like to bring us to a close, if that's okay. I want to thank the 6 other speakers who talked at the webinar. Thank you so much. We had a really interesting discussions that ensued. And thank you to the audience for asking questions. I would also like to say that the webinar is being recorded, so this will appear online relatively soon. I think Heidi can say something about that. Heidi?
Oh. And thank you so much for all your outstanding presentation today. So I have a little request. Shall we turn on the camera and take a group photo to remember this wonderful moment? So shall we turn on the camera? Okay, let's hold on for 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So we wish all of you a delightful and productive December, and welcome to participate and engage in more journal activities. Goodbye to everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Reina.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye, host. Bye, Hans. Bye.